Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we are going to talk about Immanuel Kant. There are cities in this world that seem to exist outside the ordinary flow of time. Places where the rhythm of life settles into patterns so deep and so consistent that they become almost invisible, woven into the very fabric of the streets and the stones and the slow turning of the seasons. Königsberg was such a city. It sat at the edge of the Baltic Sea, in a region where the land met the water with a kind of patient acceptance, where the winters arrived early and stayed long, and where the summer light, when it finally came, seemed all the more precious for its brevity. The city was built around the river Pregel, which wound through its centre in a series of gentle curves, dividing the town into distinct quarters connected by bridges that had stood for generations. These bridges were not merely practical structures. They were landmarks, points of orientation in a landscape that valued order and continuity above all else. It was here, in this northern city of moderate size and considerable quietness, that Immanuel Kant was born on the 22nd of April in the year 1724. The date fell in spring, though spring in Königsberg was a cautious affair, a gradual warming that advanced and retreated over the course of weeks, never quite committing to warmth until well into May. The morning of his birth would have been cool, perhaps with a pale sun struggling through high clouds, the kind of light that illuminates without quite warming. The house where he entered the world stood in a modest quarter of the city, a neighborhood of artisans and tradespeople, where the buildings leaned slightly toward one another across narrow streets, and where the sound of hammers and saws provided a steady background music to daily life. His father, Johann Georg Kant, was a harness maker, a craftsman who worked with leather and metal, creating the intricate assemblies of straps and buckles and rings that allowed horses to pull carriages and wagons through the streets and country roads of East Prussia. It was skilled work, requiring precision and patience, an attention to detail that could not be rushed. Each piece had to fit exactly, had to bear weight and strain without failing, and the reputation of a harness maker rested on the reliability of his products. Johann Georg was known for his conscientiousness, for the care he brought to his craft, and for a certain quiet dignity that marked his interactions with customers and neighbors alike. He was not a wealthy man, but neither was he poor. He occupied that broad middle ground of respectable labor, where a family could live comfortably if they were prudent, where there was enough for necessities and occasional small comforts, but where luxury was neither expected nor particularly desired. Kant's mother, Anna Regina, was the daughter of another craftsman, and she brought to the household a deep religious sensibility that would shape the atmosphere of the home profoundly. She was a follower of Pietism, a movement within Lutheranism that emphasized personal devotion, moral seriousness, and an inward focus on one's relationship with God. Pietism was not concerned with grand theological debates or elaborate rituals. It valued sincerity over formality, the condition of the heart over the correctness of doctrine. Anna Regina embodied these values completely. She prayed regularly, read from the scriptures, and sought to instill in her children a sense of moral responsibility and spiritual awareness that went beyond mere obedience to rules. Her faith was not a matter of weekly attendance at church services. though she certainly attended. It was a continuous presence in her daily life, shaping how she spoke, how she treated others, how she understood the purpose and meaning of existence. The household into which Immanuel was born was therefore marked by two qualities that would remain with him throughout his life: a commitment to skilled, disciplined work and a serious engagement with questions of morality and duty. These were not abstract principles imposed from outside. They were lived realities, visible in the way his father approached his workbench each morning, in the way his mother guided her children through their prayers and their studies, in the very texture of daily routines. The house itself was simple, the rooms not large but adequate, the furniture plain but well made. There would have been a workshop space where Johann Georg conducted his trade, filled with the smell of leather and oil, with tools hanging in their proper places, with works in progress in various states of completion. There would have been a main living area where the family gathered for meals, where the light came through small windows, where in winter a stove provided warmth against the cold that seeped through the walls. Immanuel was the fourth of 9 children, though not all of his siblings would survive to adulthood. Infant mortality was common in that era, a shadow that fell across many families, a reality accepted with sorrow, but also with a kind of resignation born of long familiarity. The presence of many children in a small household meant that quiet was a rare commodity, that privacy was limited, that one learned early to find stillness within oneself rather than in one's surroundings. Yet there was also a certain warmth to such an arrangement, a sense of being part of something larger than oneself, a network of relationships and responsibilities that bound the family together. From his earliest years, Immanuel appears to have been a child of delicate constitution. He was small for his age, thin, with a chest that seemed too narrow, a physical fragility that concerned his parents and would remain a characteristic throughout his life. He was not robust in the way that some children are, not given to rough play or strenuous activity. Instead, he displayed a kind of careful watchfulness, an alertness to his surroundings that suggested an inner life already rich and active. His mother, observing this quality in her son, may have recognized in him a particular receptivity to the moral and spiritual instruction she valued so highly. She took special care with his early education, teaching him to read, guiding him through biblical passages, encouraging in him a seriousness of purpose that might have seemed unusual in one so young. The city around him was a world of sounds and rhythms. Königsberg was a mercantile centre, a place where ships arrived from distant ports carrying goods and news, where warehouses lined the riverbanks, where merchants conducted their business in offices and counting houses scattered throughout the town. The city had a university, founded more than a century earlier, which gave it a certain intellectual character, though this was tempered by the practical concerns of trade and governance. There were churches, of course several of them, their spires rising above the rooftops, their bells marking the hours and calling the faithful to worship. There were markets where farmers from the surrounding countryside brought their produce, where one could purchase bread and meat and vegetables, where the exchange of coins and goods created a constant murmur of transaction and negotiation. The streets were unpaved in many areas, turning to mud in wet weather, freezing hard in winter, dusty in the brief, dry spells of summer. Walking through the city meant navigating these conditions, stepping carefully, aware of one's footing, attentive to the physical reality of the ground beneath one's feet. Houses were built close together, their facades presenting a somewhat uniform appearance, with shuttered windows and steep roofs designed to shed the heavy snows that came each winter. In the older parts of the city, the buildings might lean at odd angles, having settled over decades into the soft ground, creating narrow alleys and unexpected courtyards. The climate of Königsberg was severe. Winter dominated the calendar, arriving in November and often lingering into April. The cold was not the dramatic, crystalline cold of the high mountains, but a damp, penetrating chill that worked its way into bones and buildings, that required constant fires and heavy clothing, that limited outdoor activity to what was absolutely necessary. The sun rose late in winter and set early, so that much of life was conducted in lamplight and firelight, in the warm glow of interiors, while outside the world turned grey and white and still. Snow fell frequently, accumulating in drifts, muffling sound, transforming the familiar streets into something quieter and stranger. Spring, when it finally came, was a slow awakening. The ice on the river broke up gradually, with loud cracks and groans that echoed through the city. The snow melted into slush, then into running water that flowed through the streets and into the drains and ditches. Gradually, tentatively, the world turned green. Trees that had stood bare and black against the winter sky began to show small buds, then leaves. The air lost some of its bite, though cool mornings remained common well into May. Birds returned, their songs adding a new layer to the soundscape of the city. Summer in Königsberg was brief and mild. The days lengthened dramatically, so that by midsummer the sky never became fully dark, the twilight lasting for hours, a strange and beautiful phenomenon that allowed for extended activity and gave the season a dreamy, suspended quality. The warmth was pleasant, but rarely excessive, making it possible to work and walk comfortably, to enjoy the outdoors without the oppression of heat. Gardens bloomed, flowers appeared in window boxes, the smell of growing things filled the air. But always, even in the midst of summer, there was an awareness that this was temporary, that the wheel would turn again, that autumn and then winter would return. Autumn came early, often by September. The light changed first, becoming more golden, more slanted, the shadows growing longer even at midday. Leaves turned colour, though the palette was muted compared to more southerly regions, more browns and yellows than brilliant reds. The air grew crisp, then cold. The first frosts arrived, killing the last of the summer flowers, turning the remaining green to brown. By October, winter was already announcing itself, and by November it had arrived in earnest. This was the cycle within which young Immanuel grew, a rhythm as regular as breathing, as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. The seasons shaped life in fundamental ways. They determined when certain kinds of work could be done, what foods were available, how one dressed, how one moved through the world. They provided a structure, a framework of expectation and preparation that gave life a certain stability even in its repetitions. The Kant household participated fully in this rhythm. In winter, the family gathered close to the warmth of the stove. the children doing their lessons by lamplight, Johann Georg working at tasks that could be done indoors, Anna Regina managing the household with the careful economy that winter demanded. In spring, there was cleaning and repair, the airing out of rooms that had been shut tight against the cold, the renewal of activities that had been suspended. Summer brought longer working hours, the opportunity to accomplish tasks that required good weather, the pleasure of occasional leisure in the extended daylight. Autumn was a time of preparation, of putting by stores for the coming winter, of making ready for the long months of cold. For a child growing up in such an environment, the patterns became deeply ingrained. One learned to anticipate, to prepare, to find security in regularity. One learned that time was not an undifferentiated flow, but a structured progression, that each season had its character and its demands, that life was most successful when aligned with these natural rhythms rather than fighting against them. Young Immanuel, watchful and sensitive, absorbed these lessons without necessarily being taught them explicitly. They were simply the air he breathed, the ground he walked upon. His early childhood wasn't marked by dramatic events. There were no great adventures, no sudden changes of fortune, no catastrophes or windfalls. Instead, there was the slow accumulation of days, each much like the one before, each contributing its small share to the building of a life. He played, as children do, though perhaps more quietly than some. He helped with small household tasks as he grew old enough. He attended to his mother's instruction, learning his letters, learning the stories of Scripture, learning the hymns that pietists sang, simple melodies that emphasized the words rather than elaborate musical effects. The religious atmosphere of the home was pervasive, but not oppressive. Anna Regina did not rule through fear or harsh punishment. Her approach was gentler, based on persuasion and example, on the cultivation of conscience rather than mere obedience. She wanted her children to internalize the values she held dear, to make them their own, to act rightly, not because they feared punishment, but because they understood it to be their duty. This approach required patience and consistency, a willingness to explain and re-explain, to guide rather than command. It was an approach well suited to young Immanuel's temperament, which was already inclined toward reflection and order. The city beyond the household was a place of both familiarity and mystery. As a young child, Immanuel's world would have been quite small, centered on his home and the immediate neighborhood. But gradually, as he grew, that world expanded. He would have accompanied his mother to market, walking through streets he came to know intimately, learning the locations of shops and workshops, recognizing faces, absorbing the social geography of the city. He would have attended church, sitting through long services, listening to sermons that emphasized moral duty and personal salvation, singing those simple hymns, observing the rituals that marked the passage of the liturgical year. Königsberg itself was a city with layers of history. It had been founded by the Teutonic Knights centuries earlier, a fortress settlement on the edge of Christendom, gradually growing into a commercial center. The older sections of the city retained something of this martial past, with remnants of walls and fortifications, with narrow defensive streets. But by the early 18th century, when Immanuel was born, Königsberg was thoroughly civilian, thoroughly commercial, a place where business and learning coexisted, where the university drew students from across the region, where books and ideas circulated alongside the more tangible goods of trade. The presence of the university meant that the city had an intellectual life beyond what might be expected in a provincial capital. There were professors whose lectures attracted students and interested townspeople. There were libraries and collections. There were discussions and debates on matters of philosophy and science and theology. This intellectual atmosphere was part of the city's character, though it touched different inhabitants in different ways. For a harness maker's family, the university was not an immediate presence, but neither was it entirely remote. Education was valued, learning was respected, and the idea that knowledge had worth beyond its immediate practical application was part of the shared culture. As young Immanuel moved through his early years, growing slowly, observing carefully, absorbing the lessons of home and city and season, the foundations were being laid for a life that would eventually encompass those very heights of intellectual achievement the university represented. But in childhood, such futures are invisible. There is only the present, only the daily round of small experiences, only the gradual accumulation of habits and understandings that will later reveal their full significance. He was simply a boy in a northern city, somewhat frail, somewhat serious, loved by his mother, part of a large and modest family, living within the reliable rhythms of a world that seemed, in those early years, to be essentially stable and knowable. The house on that spring morning in 1724 would have been filled with the ordinary sounds of birth and new life. His mother's labor, attended by a midwife and perhaps female neighbors, would have been conducted in the relative privacy of a bedroom, while his father and siblings waited elsewhere in the house, continuing as best they could with the routines of the day. When the child finally arrived, small and apparently fragile, he was given the name Immanuel, which means God with us, a name chosen perhaps by his mother, reflecting her deep faith, her hope that this child would grow in the presence and awareness of the divine. It was a name that carried weight, that suggested purpose and destiny, though whether Anna Regina imagined the particular destiny that would actually unfold, we cannot know. The infant was wrapped and tended, nursing at his mother's breast, sleeping in a cradle near the warmth of the stove, watched over by siblings who were themselves still children, learning the ways of the world. The city outside continued its business, indifferent to this small addition to its population. Ships came and went on the river, merchants tallied their accounts, professors lectured to their students, the bells of the churches rang out the hours. Spring advanced slowly into summer. The light lengthened, the warmth increased, and the newest member of the Kant family began the long, slow process of becoming himself. Part 2. The education of a child in 18th century Königsberg began, for most families, within the home. It was there that fundamental lessons were taught, not only reading and writing and basic arithmetic, but also the moral and spiritual framework within which these skills would be used. For the Kant family, this domestic education was particularly important, shaped as it was by Anna Regina's pietist convictions. She believed that education was not merely the acquisition of information, but the formation of character, the development of a soul capable of discerning right from wrong, of acting according to duty rather than mere inclination. This was serious work, requiring time and attention, and she devoted herself to it with a kind of quiet intensity. Young Immanuel proved to be an apt pupil. He learned his letters quickly, showing an unusual facility with written language even at a young age. His mother would sit with him at the table, guiding his small hand as he traced the shapes of letters, sounding out words, beginning the long process of unlocking the meanings contained in books. The Bible was central to this instruction, as it was in most pietist households. He learned to read by reading Scripture, absorbing not only the mechanics of literacy, but also the stories and teachings that his mother considered essential to a good life. The language of the Bible, with its rhythms and its gravity, its mixture of narrative and exhortation, became familiar to him, a kind of second language that ran parallel to ordinary speech. But Anna Regina was not concerned only with religious instruction. She understood that her son would need to make his way in the world, that he would need skills and knowledge beyond what Scripture alone could provide. She saw in him a brightness, a capacity for learning that deserved cultivation. She may have spoken with her husband about this, about the possibility that Immanuel might receive more formal education than was typical for a craftsman's son. Such education was not easily obtained, required resources, connections, decisions that would affect the entire family. But the seed was planted. The idea took root that this particular child might have a future that extended beyond the workshop. When Immanuel was about 8 years old, arrangements were made for him to attend the Collegium Fridericianum, a pietist school in Königsberg that offered a more rigorous and comprehensive education than what was available in ordinary parish schools. This was a significant step, one that required sacrifice from the family. The school was not free, and though the fees may have been modest by the standards of wealthier families, they represented a real expense for a harness maker's household. Moreover, attendance at the collegium meant a commitment of time, a redirection of the child's energies away from helping with the family's work. But Johann Georg and Anna Regina made this choice, motivated by their belief in the value of education and by their hope for their son's future. The Collegium Fridericianum had been founded earlier in the century by a pietist theologian, and it maintained a strong emphasis on religious instruction alongside classical learning. Students studied Latin and Greek, the languages of scholarship and scripture, as well as mathematics, history, and natural philosophy. The curriculum was demanding, the discipline strict, the atmosphere one of serious purpose. Classes began early in the morning and continued through much of the day, with little time for idleness or recreation. Students were expected to work hard, to show respect for their teachers, to conduct themselves with propriety at all times. For young Immanuel, entering this environment must have been both exciting and daunting. He was leaving the familiar confines of his neighborhood, venturing each day into a different part of the city, into a building where learning was the primary business, where he would be surrounded by other boys engaged in the same pursuit. The school building itself was substantial, designed to house classrooms and dormitories, though Immanuel, living in Königsberg, would have walked to school each day rather than boarding. The walk itself became part of the routine, a daily journey through the city streets, observing the shopkeepers opening their establishments, the labourers heading to their work, the gradual transformation of the city from the quiet of early morning to the bustle of midday. The instruction at the collegium was rigorous and often repetitive. Latin grammar was drilled relentlessly, the declensions and conjugations repeated until they became automatic, until students could pass a sentence almost without thought. Greek followed, equally demanding, equally systematic. The classical authors were read not for their literary beauty alone, though that was appreciated, but as models of clear thinking and precise expression. Students translated passages from Latin to German and back again, learning to move between languages with facility, developing a sensitivity to nuance and structure that would serve them well in any intellectual pursuit. Mathematics was taught with similar thoroughness, beginning with basic arithmetic and progressing through geometry and elementary algebra. The emphasis was on understanding principles rather than merely performing calculations, on grasping the underlying logic that made mathematics a reliable tool for investigating the world. Natural philosophy, what we would now call science, was taught more theoretically than experimentally. Students learned about the properties of matter, the motions of celestial bodies, the classification of natural phenomena, all presented within a framework that saw the natural world as evidence of divine order and purpose. Religious instruction was woven throughout the curriculum. Each day began and ended with prayer. Biblical passages were studied in their original Greek and Hebrew, when students advanced far enough. Theology was taught, systematically, with an emphasis on personal piety and moral rectitude. The pietist approach meant that students were encouraged not merely to learn doctrine, but to examine their own hearts, to cultivate an awareness of their spiritual state, to take seriously their responsibilities to God and to their fellow human beings. Immanuel seems to have thrived academically in this environment, even as he found some aspects of it difficult. He excelled in languages and mathematics, showing a natural aptitude for systematic thinking, for following an argument through its steps, for identifying inconsistencies and gaps in reasoning. His memory was excellent, allowing him to retain large amounts of material, to recall passages he had studied weeks or months earlier. His teachers recognized his abilities and began to single him out as a particularly promising student. But the relentless emphasis on religious discipline was harder for him. The pietist insistence on constant self-examination, on the surveillance of one's own thoughts and feelings for signs of sin or unworthiness, could be burdensome for a sensitive child. There was a danger in this approach, a risk that the search for purity and righteousness could become oppressive, that the awareness of one's failings could overshadow the simple joys of existence. Later in life, Kant would speak with some reserve about his time at the collegium, suggesting that the intensity of its religious atmosphere had been at times stifling. He retained his respect for the moral seriousness of pietism, for its emphasis on duty and conscience, but he seems to have felt that the particular forms it took at the school were sometimes excessive, that they risked reducing religion to a kind of anxious scrupulosity. Despite these reservations, he remained at the collegium for 8 years, completing the full course of study. During this time, he was largely isolated from the rougher aspects of boyhood. The school discouraged frivolous recreation, looked with suspicion on anything that might distract students from their studies or their spiritual development. Immanuel was not an athlete, not drawn to physical competition or display. He was quiet, reserved, more comfortable with books than with boisterous companionship. This made him something of an outsider among his peers, though it also meant he was able to focus his energies on his studies without the distractions that affected other boys. His routine during these years was highly structured. He woke early before dawn in winter and made his way through the dark streets to school. The morning hours were devoted to Latin and Greek, to the careful passing of texts, to translation and composition. Midday brought a brief break for a simple meal, often eaten quickly, without ceremony. The afternoon was given to mathematics and natural philosophy, to theology and biblical studies. In the late afternoon, he would walk home again, arriving as twilight was settling over. The city, the lamps being lit in windows, the day drawing toward its close. At home, he would have had evening chores and responsibilities, though his parents seemed to have protected his time for study. He would review the day's lessons, prepare for the next day, read on his own when he could. His mother, though lacking formal education herself, followed his progress with interest and pride, asking him about what he was learning, encouraging him to explain to her the concepts and ideas he was encountering. These conversations may have been important for Immanuel, forcing him to articulate his understanding clearly, to find ways of making complex material accessible to someone without his training. The years at the Collegium were years of formation in a deep sense. They established habits of discipline and systematic work that would remain with Kant throughout his life. They gave him the tools of classical learning, the languages and logical skills that were the common currency of educated discourse in his era. They exposed him to ideas and arguments that would later become the starting points for his own philosophical investigations. But perhaps most importantly, they taught him the value of order and routine, the way in which regular habits and structured time could create space for sustained intellectual work. The city around him continued its familiar rhythms. The seasons turned, winter giving way to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, and then winter again. The river froze and thawed, ships came and went, markets operated, the university conducted its business. Immanuel walked the same streets year after year, growing taller though never robust, becoming familiar with every corner and alley between his home and the school, developing a relationship with the physical geography of Königsberg that would last his entire life. His mother watched him grow with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Satisfaction because he was clearly gifted, clearly destined for something beyond the craft workshop. Concern because he was so delicate, so unworldly in some ways, so absorbed in his studies that he seemed at times to barely notice the practical realities of daily existence. She worried about his health, about whether he was eating enough, sleeping enough, whether the intensity of his intellectual work was too much for his slight frame. But she also trusted in divine providence, believing that her son was being prepared for some purpose, that his gifts were not accidental, but part of a larger plan. Johann Georg, working at his harness making, took pride in his son's achievements without fully understanding them. He had made his living with his hands, with tangible materials that could be shaped and joined and sold. The world of books and ideas was foreign to him, though he respected it. He supported the decision to send Immanuel to the Collegium, paying the fees from his modest income, making the sacrifices necessary to continue this investment in education. He may have hoped that his son would eventually enter the ministry, that all this learning would lead to a respectable position as a pastor or perhaps a teacher, roles that commanded respect in the community and offered a degree of security. As Immanuel progressed through his years at the Collegium, the question of what would come next began to present itself. The school prepared students for university study, particularly in theology. It was expected that the most able students would continue their education at the University of Königsberg, would pursue further training that would equip them for learned professions. For a family of modest means, this presented challenges. University study required resources, time during which the student would not be earning an income, would in fact be incurring expenses. But it was also an opportunity, a path to a different kind of life. In the summer of 1740, when Immanuel was 16 years old, he completed his studies at the Collegium Fridericianum. He had distinguished himself sufficiently that university attendance seemed not only possible, but expected. His teachers had encouraged him, had spoken to him about the importance of continuing his education, about the opportunities that would be available to someone with his abilities. He had become particularly interested in natural philosophy and mathematics, in questions about how the world worked, about the principles that governed physical phenomena. These interests coexisted with the theological training he had received, creating a tension that would need to be resolved, a question of where to direct his energies and attention. That summer was warm, as Königsberg summers could sometimes be, the long days allowing for extended periods of light and activity. Immanuel may have had more free time than usual, a brief interval between the completion of one phase of education and the beginning of another. He might have walked through the city with a new sense of awareness, seeing it now as someone about to enter its university, about to join that community of learning that gave Königsberg much of its character. The river would have been busy with boat traffic, the markets full of summer produce, the streets crowded with residents enjoying the brief, warm season. The cathedral bells would have rung the hours, marking the passage of time in the way they had done throughout his childhood. He stood at a threshold, though he could not have fully understood what lay ahead. The boy who had entered the Collegium Fridericianum 8 years earlier had been shaped and refined by rigorous discipline, by classical learning, by religious instruction that emphasized duty and self-examination. He had developed habits of study, an ability to focus his attention, a capacity for systematic thought. But he was still very young, still in many ways unformed, still discovering who he might become. The familiar city around him, with its bridges and churches and winding streets, its cold winters and brief summers, its reliable routines and quiet dignity, had shaped him in ways both obvious and subtle. He was a product of this place, and he would remain tied to it in ways that would seem, to later observers, almost inexplicable. But that was the future. In that summer of 1740, There was simply the present moment, the warm light, the slow movement toward the next chapter of his life. Part 3. The University of Königsberg stood in the heart of the city, its buildings clustered near the cathedral, forming a kind of intellectual center that drew students from across East Prussia and beyond. When Immanuel Kant enrolled in the autumn of 1740, he was joining an institution that had existed for nearly 2 centuries, an institution that carried the weight of tradition while also participating in the new currents of thought that were beginning to transform European intellectual life. The university was not large by the standards of older and more prestigious institutions in other parts of Germany, but it was respectable, it had competent faculty, and it offered serious students the opportunity to pursue advanced study in theology, law, medicine, and philosophy. Kant entered the university as a theology student, which was expected given his background at the Collegium Fridericianum and his family's hopes that he might enter the ministry. But his interests were already broader than conventional theological study. He was drawn to natural philosophy, to mathematics, to the emerging sciences that promised to reveal the workings of the natural world through observation and reason. The university curriculum of his era allowed for considerable flexibility, particularly in the early years of study, and Kant took full advantage of this, attending lectures in a wide range of subjects, reading extensively, beginning the process of developing his own understanding of how knowledge was acquired and what it could reveal. The rhythm of university life was different from what he had known at the Collegium. There was more freedom, more responsibility for managing one's own time and choosing one's own course of study. Lectures were offered at various times throughout the day, and students could select which to attend based on their interests and the requirements of their particular course of study. There were no examinations at the end of each term, no constant surveillance of daily progress. Instead, the university assumed that students were sufficiently mature and motivated to pursue their studies without such external constraints. For some, this freedom was overwhelming, leading to idleness or dissipation. For Kant, it was an opportunity to follow his intellectual curiosity wherever it led. He attended lectures on metaphysics and logic, on physics and mathematics, on theology and biblical interpretation. He read widely in the library, working his way through the classical authors and the more modern thinkers who were beginning to reshape philosophy. He was particularly influenced by the work of Isaac Newton, whose mathematical physics had demonstrated that the motions of heavenly bodies and earthly objects alike could be explained by universal laws expressed in precise mathematical form. This vision of a lawful, comprehensible universe, governed by principles that human reason could discover and articulate, was profoundly attractive to Kant. It suggested that the world was not arbitrary or chaotic, but ordered and intelligible. At the same time, he was studying the philosophy of Leibniz and Wolff, German philosophers who had developed elaborate systems meant to explain all of reality through the power of reason alone. Their approach was rationalistic, proceeding from first principles to conclusions, building comprehensive frameworks that aimed to encompass everything from the nature of God to the properties of matter. Kant absorbed this tradition, learned to think, within its categories and methods, even as he began to notice certain difficulties and tensions that would later lead him to develop his own, quite different approach. His teachers at the university recognized his abilities. One professor in particular, Martin Knudsen, seems to have taken a special interest in the young student. Knudsen taught logic and metaphysics, and he was also knowledgeable about the new physics and astronomy. He introduced Kant to the latest scientific developments, encouraged him to read Newton and other natural philosophers, helped him to see connections between different fields of study. Knudsen was a pietist himself, and he may have seen in Kant a kindred spirit, someone who combined intellectual rigor with moral seriousness, who sought truth not for its own sake alone, but as a guide to living rightly. Under Knudsen's influence, Kant began to think about questions that would occupy him for the rest of his life. How do we acquire knowledge about the world? What are the limits of what we can know? How do sensory experience and rational thought work together to produce understanding? What is the relationship between the laws of nature and the freedom of human action? These were not idle academic puzzles. They were questions with profound implications for how one understood oneself and one's place in the universe, for how one lived and what one valued. The university years were also years of financial struggle. Kant's family could provide only limited support, and university expenses, though modest, were real. He needed money for lodging, for food, for books, for the various fees that the university charged. To supplement what his family could provide, he began taking on work as a tutor, teaching younger students or the children of wealthy families in the city. This was common practice among poorer university students, a way to earn enough to continue one's studies. But it was also time-consuming, and it meant that Kant's days were filled, not only with his own studies, but also with the work of teaching others. He seems to have been a competent tutor, patient and clear in his explanations, able to break down complex material into manageable pieces. His students made progress under his instruction, and word spread that he was a reliable and effective teacher. This early experience with teaching would prove valuable later, giving him practice in the art of explaining difficult concepts, in finding examples and analogies that could make abstract ideas concrete and accessible. But tutoring also took him away from the sustained, uninterrupted study that he craved. He had to manage his time carefully, fitting his own reading and thinking into the spaces between tutoring sessions and university lectures. This required discipline, a commitment to making the most of whatever time was available. It meant rising early, working late, using even small fragments of time productively. It meant choosing carefully what to read, what to focus on, what to set aside for later. The city remained his constant companion during these years. He walked its streets daily, coming to know them with an intimacy that went beyond mere familiarity. He noticed details that others might overlook, the way light fell on a particular building at a certain time of day, the sound of footsteps echoing in a narrow alley, the smell of the river when the wind came from a particular direction. These sensory impressions, accumulated over time, became part of the fabric of his consciousness, part of the background against which his thinking occurred. The seasons continued their reliable cycle. Winter brought its cold and darkness, its need to stay indoors, its long evenings by lamplight. Spring arrived slowly, the ice breaking up on the river, with sounds like thunder, the gradual greening of the few trees in the city, the return of migratory birds. Summer was brief but pleasant, the light lasting late into the evening, making it possible to read, outdoors, to walk without the burden of heavy clothing, to feel the warmth of the sun on one's face. Autumn came too quickly, the light already beginning to fade by September, the first frosts warning of what was to come. Kant's health during these years remained delicate. He was prone to minor illnesses, to digestive complaints, to headaches. He learned to manage these conditions through careful attention to diet and routine, avoiding excess, maintaining regular hours of sleep and work. He was not robust enough for the drinking and carousing that characterized student life for many of his contemporaries. His pleasures were quieter: a good book, a stimulating conversation, a solitary walk along the river at twilight. His social circle was small but valued. He had a few close friends among his fellow students, young men who shared his intellectual interests, who could engage in serious discussion about philosophy and science. They would meet in rented rooms or quiet corners of the university, talking for hours about the questions that occupied them, debating the merits of different philosophical systems, sharing what they had learned from their reading. These conversations were not frivolous. They were part of the essential work of learning, the process by which ideas are tested and refined through dialogue and argument. As the years passed, Kant made slow but steady progress toward completing his degree. The requirements for graduation included not only attending lectures and reading prescribed texts, but also demonstrating one's knowledge through participation in formal disputations, and eventually writing a dissertation. This was a lengthy process, and Kant, hampered by his need to earn money through tutoring, was in no position to rush through it. He worked at his own pace, taking the time he needed to master the material, to think through problems carefully, to develop his understanding systematically. During this period, his mother became seriously ill. The nature of her illness is not precisely known, but it was severe enough to cause great concern to the family. Kant, deeply devoted to her, must have been profoundly affected by this development. She had been his first teacher, the one who had instilled in him his moral seriousness, his sense of duty and responsibility. Her faith had shaped the atmosphere of his childhood, and though he was beginning to develop his own relationship to religious questions, one that was more intellectual and less emotionally expressive than hers, he retained a deep respect for her convictions and her character. Anna Regina died in 1747, when Kant was 23 years old. Her death was a significant loss, removing from his life the person who had perhaps understood him best, who had recognized his gifts and encouraged their development. He grieved in his own quiet way, carrying on with his studies and his work, because that was what duty required. But feeling the absence of her presence, her guidance, her love. The loss may have reinforced certain tendencies that were already present in his character. He became, if anything, more reserved, more focused on his intellectual work, more inclined to seek stability and order in external routines as a way of managing internal uncertainties. The world of ideas, with its logical structures and rational arguments, offered a kind of solace. a realm where questions had answers, where confusion could be resolved through patient analysis, where truth could be pursued with confidence. He continued to attend lectures, to read, to tutor, to walk the familiar streets of Königsberg. The university became increasingly familiar to him, its buildings and classrooms and library almost like a second home. He knew where to find specific books in the library, knew which professors were most worth attending, knew the quiet corners where he could work undisturbed. The physical spaces of learning became associated in his mind with the intellectual work he was doing, so that to think about philosophy was also to think about particular rooms and desks and windows, particular times of day and qualities of light. In 1749, after 9 years as a student, Kant was ready to write his dissertation and defend it. This was a significant milestone, the culmination of his university studies, the final requirement for his degree. The topic he chose was one that combined his interests in philosophy and natural science, the measurement of living forces, a question about how to calculate the motion and energy of moving bodies. It was a technical topic, dealing with disputes among different schools of physics about the proper way to understand force and motion. But it also had broader implications, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of causation and physical law. Writing the dissertation was painstaking work. Every argument had to be constructed carefully, every claim supported with evidence or reasoning, every possible objection anticipated and addressed. Kant worked on it during whatever free time he could find, often late at night after his tutoring work was done, sitting at his desk with a lamp burning, writing in his neat, careful hand, crossing out and revising, thinking through each point until he was satisfied that it was as clear and correct as he could make it. When the dissertation was finally completed and submitted, the formal disputation was scheduled. This was a public event held in the university, where Kant would present his ideas and defend them against objections raised by faculty members and other students. It was a test not only of his knowledge, but of his ability to think on his feet, to respond to challenges, to articulate his position clearly under pressure. The disputation went well. Kant demonstrated his command of the material, responded effectively to questions and criticisms, showed himself to be a serious and capable scholar. The degree was awarded, and he was now Immanuel Kant, Master of Philosophy, qualified to teach at the university level should the opportunity arise. But there was no immediate opportunity. University positions were scarce, and they typically went to those with connections or those willing to wait many years for an opening. Kant had neither the connections nor the financial resources to wait without employment. He needed to earn a living, and the only practical way to do so was to continue working as a private tutor. This meant leaving Königsberg, at least temporarily, taking positions in country estates or small towns where wealthy families wanted education for their children and were willing to hire a university graduate to provide it. For the next several years, from 1749 to 1755, Kant worked as a private tutor in various locations outside Königsberg. This was a period of relative obscurity, a time when his intellectual development continued, but his public presence was minimal. He lived in other people's households, accommodating himself to their schedules and preferences, teaching children subjects he knew well, but that did not particularly challenge him intellectually. It was, in many ways, a frustrating period, a necessary interlude while he waited for the chance to pursue his real work. Yet even during this time, he continued to think, to read when he could, to develop the ideas that would eventually make his reputation. The countryside around Königsberg, with its forests and fields, its small villages and manor houses, was different from the city he knew so well. The rhythms of rural life, tied even more directly to the seasons and to agricultural work, provided a different perspective, a reminder of the varied ways human beings organized their lives and made sense of their world. He tutored the children of several families, teaching them languages and mathematics, history and geography, the classical subjects that were considered essential for an educated person. He was patient with his students, understanding that not everyone had his own passion for learning, that for many children education was simply a requirement to be endured rather than a calling to be embraced. He did his work competently, earned his keep, and waited for the opportunity to return to Königsberg and to the intellectual life he had left behind. During these years away from the city, he may have appreciated more fully what Königsberg meant to him. The familiar streets and bridges, the sound of the cathedral bells, the sight of the river flowing through the town, the university buildings where he had spent so many hours, all of these took on a new significance in their absence. He had grown up in that city, had been formed by it, and it remained the place where he felt most himself, most at home in the deepest sense. By 1755, he had saved enough money and had developed sufficient scholarly work to make a return possible. He had written several essays on scientific and philosophical topics, demonstrating that his thinking had continued to develop, that he had original contributions to make to ongoing debates. He was ready to seek the position he really wanted, a place on the faculty of the University of Königsberg, where he could teach and pursue his research, where he could join the community of scholars, where he could make his life's work the pursuit and sharing of knowledge. Part 4. The return to Königsberg in 1755 marked the beginning of a new phase in Kant's life, one in which he would finally be able to pursue his intellectual vocation in earnest. He was 31 years old, no longer a student, but not yet established in any permanent position, returning to the city that had shaped him with both hope and uncertainty about what the future might hold. The years away as a tutor had been necessary, had provided him with income and time to develop his thinking. But they had also been years of waiting, of preparing for a life that had not yet fully begun. To secure a position at the university, Kant needed to complete the requirements for what was called the habilitation, an advanced degree beyond the master's that would qualify him to lecture as a private docent, a private instructor. Private docenten were not salaried faculty members. They were licensed to offer lectures at the university and to collect fees directly from students who chose to attend. It was a precarious position, dependent entirely on one's ability to attract students, but it was also the customary path toward eventually securing a permanent professorship. Kant set to work on the required dissertations. The university demanded two: one to be defended publicly, demonstrating the candidate's scholarly ability, and another to be submitted for evaluation by the faculty. he chose topics that reflected his ongoing interests in natural philosophy and metaphysics, writing on fire and on the first principles of metaphysical knowledge. The work was demanding, requiring him to engage with the latest scientific theories and philosophical debates, to position his own ideas in relation to established authorities, to write with the precision and clarity that academic discourse required. He completed the work quickly, driven by his eagerness to begin teaching and by the financial necessity of establishing a source of income. The public disputation was held in September of 1755, and once again Kant demonstrated his competence, defending his positions ably against challenges from faculty and students. The habilitation was granted, and he was now authorized to offer lectures at the University of Königsberg. He began teaching immediately, announcing courses in mathematics, physics, logic, and metaphysics. The range of subjects reflected both the breadth of his knowledge and the practical reality that he needed to attract as many students as possible. He could not afford to specialize too narrowly, to focus only on the topics that interested him most. He had to offer what students wanted or needed, had to prove himself useful and engaging across multiple disciplines. His lectures were held in various rooms around the university, sometimes in formal lecture halls, sometimes in smaller spaces, rented for the purpose. The schedule was demanding, with classes offered at different times throughout the day to accommodate students with varying commitments. Kant would prepare his lectures carefully, working from notes that he continually revised and updated, thinking through how best to present each topic, what examples would be most effective, what difficulties students were likely to encounter. In the classroom, he spoke clearly and methodically, without dramatic gestures or rhetorical flourishes. His manner was serious, but not severe, focused on conveying ideas as precisely as possible, rather than on entertaining or impressing his audience. He assumed that his students were there to learn, that they would appreciate clarity and thoroughness, that they would be willing to engage with difficult material if it was presented systematically. This approach worked. Students found his lectures helpful, his explanations lucid, his treatment of topics comprehensive. Word spread that Kant was a good teacher, and enrollment in his courses grew. But teaching for fees was an uncertain livelihood. The number of students varied from term to term, depending on their interests and on what other courses were available. Kant had no guarantee of income from one semester to the next, no security against the possibility that students might choose other instructors or other subjects. He had to supplement his teaching income with other work, continuing to take on private tutoring when opportunities arose, writing occasional pieces for publication, living as frugally as possible. His rooms during this period were modest, located in rented lodgings near the E.T. University. He had a small space for sleeping and working, furnished simply with a bed, a desk, some chairs, shelves for his growing collection of books. The walls were bare, or nearly so, the floors uncarpeted, the windows looking out onto streets he had known since childhood. It was not grand or particularly comfortable, but it was his, a space where he could work undisturbed, where the order and routine he valued could be maintained. He established a daily schedule that would, with minor variations, persist for the rest of his life. He rose early before dawn in winter and devoted the first hours of the day to his own work, to reading and writing and thinking. These morning hours were precious, when his mind was freshest, when the city was still quiet, when he could work without interruption. He would sit at his desk with a lamp if necessary, wrapped in a coat if the room was cold, and engage with whatever problem or question was occupying him at the moment. Mid-morning brought lectures, the walk to the university through streets now becoming busy with the day's activity. He taught for several hours, then returned home for a midday meal. Afternoons were sometimes given to more lectures, sometimes to reading or to meeting with students who had questions or needed guidance. In the early evening, he often had a lighter meal, then more time for work or for social interaction. He was not a hermit, not entirely isolated in his scholarly pursuits. He valued conversation, enjoyed the company of intelligent and educated companions, and made time for this aspect of life, even as he protected the solitude necessary for serious thinking. His social circle in Königsberg included other faculty members, local officials, educated merchants and professionals. These were people who could engage with ideas, who read books and followed developments in philosophy and science, who appreciated good conversation over a meal or during an evening gathering. Kant became known as a witty and entertaining conversationalist, capable of discussing a wide range of topics with knowledge and insight, able to make even abstract philosophical questions accessible and interesting to non-specialists. This social dimension of his life was important to him. It provided balance, prevented him from becoming too absorbed in his own thoughts, kept him connected to the wider world of human concerns and interests. He attended dinners and small gatherings, participated in discussions at the local reading society, maintained friendships that would last for decades. These relationships were not merely social pleasantries. They were part of how he engaged with the world, part of how he tested his ideas and learned from others, part of what made life in Königsberg rich and satisfying despite its limitations. The city itself continued to provide the stable background for his life. He knew it intimately now, knew its moods and rhythms, its seasonal transformations, its social geography. He had walked these streets as a child, as a student, as a young teacher. The buildings had become familiar landmarks, the river a constant presence, the bridges points of daily passage. He could navigate the city almost without thinking, his feet carrying him along well-worn paths, while his mind was occupied with other matters. His walks became a regular feature of his routine, a daily constitutional that he took with remarkable consistency. The route was generally the same, through certain streets and past certain landmarks at a predictable time of day. Neighbors and acquaintances came to recognize him by this habit, to set their own activities by the sight of Professor Kant taking his afternoon walk. There was something almost comical about this punctuality, this absolute regularity, but there was also something profound about it. The walk was not merely exercise, though it served that purpose. It was a form of meditation, a way of giving the mind space to work through problems, to make connections, to arrive at insights that might not come from sitting at a desk. During these walks, Kant would fix his gaze on some distant point, often a landmark like a church tower, and maintain his focus there, walking steadily without being distracted by passing events or people. He was thinking, working through arguments, considering objections, refining his understanding. The physical movement seemed to facilitate mental activity, to create a rhythm conducive to thought. He would return from these walks with new clarity about whatever problem he had been wrestling with, ready to sit down and write or to revise what he had written earlier. His writing during these early years as a lecturer was varied and exploratory. He published essays on earthquakes and on the nature of fire, on the rotation of the Earth and on the aging of the planet, on the question of whether the Earth is changing its rotation over time. These were scientific or quasi-scientific pieces, engaging with empirical questions, showing that his interest in natural philosophy remained strong. He also wrote on more philosophical topics, on the concepts of motion and rest, on the nature of space and time, on how we form general concepts from particular experiences. None of these early publications made a major impact, but they established him as a serious scholar, as someone engaged with important questions, as a thinker capable of original contributions. They were part of the slow process of building a reputation, of becoming known beyond Königsberg, of positioning himself for the time when a permanent position might become available. The teaching itself was demanding, but also rewarding. Kant found that he enjoyed the challenge of making difficult ideas clear, of finding ways to help students understand concepts that might initially seem obscure or intimidating. He developed a talent for using examples and analogies, for breaking complex arguments into manageable steps, for anticipating where students would struggle and addressing those difficulties preemptively. His lectures on logic were particularly popular, offering students practical training in how to think clearly and argue rigorously, skills that would serve them well regardless of their eventual professions. He also lectured on physical geography, a subject that might seem unusual for a philosopher, but that Kant found fascinating. Physical geography in his time encompassed not only the description of the Earth's surface, but also questions about climate, about the distribution of peoples and cultures, about the relationships between environment and human society. It was an empirical discipline, drawing on travel accounts and scientific observations, but it also raised broader questions about human nature and cultural diversity. Kant never traveled far from Königsberg himself, but through reading and through conversations with those who had traveled, he developed a comprehensive knowledge of the wider world. The years passed with their familiar rhythm. Winters came and went, each much like the one before. The city locked in cold and darkness for months at a time. Life contracted to the warmth of interiors and the necessity of work. Springs arrived slowly, the thaw gradual and sometimes interrupted by late snows, the return of warmth and light, always welcome, but never taken for granted. Summers were brief interludes of relative ease, when the long days allowed for extended activity, when the city opened up and outdoor life became possible. Autumns were beautiful and melancholy, the light golden and slanted, the awareness of approaching winter adding urgency to the completion of tasks that required decent weather. Kant remained in his modest lodgings, living simply, saving what money he could, waiting for the opportunity that would bring greater security and allow him to focus more completely on his philosophical work. That opportunity would eventually come, but it was slow in arriving. University positions opened rarely, and when they did, the appointments were often influenced by factors beyond mere scholarly merit. One needed connections, needed to be known to those who made decisions, needed sometimes to be willing to compromise or to accept positions that were not ideal. In the meantime, he taught and wrote and walked and thought. He became a familiar figure in the city, the philosophy lecturer who kept such regular hours, who could be seen at predictable times on his predictable route, who was known for his learning and his wit, who lived quietly and modestly, but who was gradually becoming recognized as one of Königsberg's notable citizens. His life had found a pattern, a sustainable rhythm that allowed him to pursue what mattered most to him, while also meeting the practical necessities of earning a living. The city and the man seemed made for each other. Königsberg provided the stability and order that Kant valued, the familiar environment within, which his mind could work most effectively. He provided the city with intellectual distinction, with proof that even in this northern provincial capital, serious thought and significant scholarship could flourish. Neither was particularly glamorous, neither sought attention or excitement. Both valued reliability and substance over novelty and display. It was a good match, and it would last for the remainder of Kant's life. Part 5. As the years of lecturing accumulated, Kant's reputation within the university and the broader community of Königsberg continued to grow steadily. He was known as a dedicated teacher, someone who prepared his lectures thoroughly and delivered them with clarity, who was willing to meet with students outside of class to answer questions or provide guidance, who treated even the less gifted students with patience and respect. This reputation attracted increasing numbers of students to his courses, which in turn provided more secure income and allowed him some measure of financial stability, though he remained far from wealthy. His teaching extended across a remarkable range of subjects. In addition to the core philosophical disciplines of logic, metaphysics, and ethics, he lectured on mathematics, physics, physical geography, anthropology, and even pedagogy. This breadth was partly a matter of necessity, driven by the need to attract students and earn fees, but it also reflected genuine curiosity and the conviction that all these domains of knowledge were interconnected, that understanding required drawing connections across different fields rather than remaining narrowly specialized. The lectures on physical geography were particularly popular. Kant had never traveled beyond the region immediately surrounding Königsberg, had never seen the mountains or oceans or distant lands he described. But through extensive reading of travel accounts, scientific reports, and geographical studies, he had developed a comprehensive understanding of the whole world's physical features and cultural diversity. His lectures painted vivid pictures of distant places, described the customs of different peoples, explained the relationships between climate and landscape, between environment and human society. Students found these lectures fascinating, a window onto a wider world that most of them, like Kant himself, would never experience directly. In his teaching of logic, Kant emphasized practical reasoning skills rather than merely formal rules. He wanted students to learn how to think clearly, how to construct valid arguments, how to identify fallacies and inconsistencies, how to distinguish sound reasoning from clever sophistry. These were life skills, useful in any profession or situation where clear thinking mattered. He used examples drawn from everyday experience, from legal reasoning, from scientific investigation, showing how the principles of logic applied in concrete situations rather than remaining abstract and theoretical. His metaphysics lectures dealt with the deepest questions of philosophy: the nature of existence, the relationship between mind and matter, the possibilities and limits of human knowledge, the existence and attributes of God, the nature of the soul. These were topics that had occupied philosophers for centuries, and Kant engaged with the established traditions while also beginning to develop his own distinctive approach. He was not yet ready to break completely with the systems of Leibniz and Wolff that had dominated German philosophy, but he was increasingly aware of their limitations, increasingly convinced that a new approach was needed. In ethics, he taught the conventional moral philosophy of his time, drawn largely from Christian doctrine and from ancient philosophy. But here, too, he was beginning to think in new directions. He was becoming convinced that morality could not rest on consequences or on feelings, that it had to be grounded in reason and in the autonomous will of rational beings. These ideas were still developing and still inchoate, not yet fully formed into the systematic ethical theory he would later propose. But the seeds were there, visible to careful observers in the way he framed questions, in the objections he raised to established views, in the emphasis he placed on duty and rational self-determination. The classroom became a kind of laboratory for testing ideas. Kant would present various positions, examine their strengths and weaknesses, explore their implications, all while gauging student reactions and responses. He learned what kinds of examples worked, what analogies illuminated and what obscured, how to address common confusions and misunderstandings. This pedagogical experience shaped his thinking in important ways, forcing him to clarify his own ideas, to find language that could make abstract concepts accessible, to think about how knowledge was communicated, and not merely what was known. Students who attended his lectures remembered him as an engaging teacher despite his untheatrical manner. He did not pace dramatically or raise his voice or use grand gestures. He stood relatively still, spoke in measured tones, maintained a serious but not stern demeanor. What made his lectures effective was their clarity, their systematic progression from simpler to more complex ideas, their careful attention to potential difficulties, their use of well-chosen examples. He respected his students' intelligence, assumed they were capable of understanding difficult material if it was presented properly, and they responded to this respect with attention and effort. Outside the classroom, Kant's social life continued to provide important balance to his scholarly work. He was regularly invited to dinners at the homes of Königsberg's educated elite, where conversation ranged widely over current events, scientific discoveries, philosophical debates, literary works, political developments. Kant was valued in these gatherings for his knowledge and his conversation skills, his ability to discuss serious topics without pedantry, to make learned references without seeming to show off, to disagree without being disagreeable. He had formed a particular friendship with Joseph Green, an English merchant who had settled in Königsberg and who shared Kant's intellectual interests despite lacking formal university education. Green was well-read, curious, and possessed of a practical wisdom that Kant appreciated. The two men dined together regularly, often at Green's home, and their friendship would last for decades. It was Green who would later help manage Kant's practical affairs when the philosopher's own capacities for such things began to decline. Other friendships included university colleagues, local officials, physicians, and educated members of the commercial class. Königsberg had a modest but active intellectual culture, and Kant was fully part of it. There were reading societies where recent publications were discussed, gatherings where philosophical questions were debated, dinners where news from other parts of Europe was shared and analyzed. In these contexts, Kant was not the isolated scholar of later legend, but an engaged participant in a community of learning and conversation. Yet for all this social engagement, Kant remained fundamentally disciplined about protecting time for his own work. His daily routine was structured to ensure that the essential hours for reading and writing were preserved. He rose early, worked through the morning, taught in the late morning or early afternoon, returned to work or to social engagement as the day demanded, but always maintained certain boundaries, certain times that were sacrosanct, dedicated to the solitary labor of thinking through difficult problems. His health during these years required careful management. He was not robust, was prone to various minor ailments, digestive troubles, headaches, insomnia. He dealt with these through strict attention to routine, to diet, to regular habits of sleep and exercise. He avoided excesses of any kind, drank moderately if at all, ate carefully, maintained regular hours. The famous walk became part of this health regimen, not merely a time for thinking, but also a form of exercise that he believed necessary for maintaining physical well-being. He dressed conservatively in the academic style of his time, dark clothing of good quality, but not fashionable, practical rather than decorative. His rooms remained simple, functional spaces, organized for work rather than display. He owned few possessions beyond his books, which continued to accumulate, and the basic furniture and household items necessary for daily life. There was no interest in luxury, no desire for the trappings of status beyond what his position as a university lecturer required. The years from the mid-1750s through the 1760s were a period of intellectual development during which Kant was working. Through various problems and positions, not yet having arrived at the distinctive philosophy for which he would become famous. He published a number of works during this time, some more successful than others, all showing a restless and ranging intelligence grappling with fundamental questions. In 1755, the same year he began lecturing, he published a work on natural philosophy titled Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens, in which he proposed a theory of how the solar system had formed from a rotating cloud of gas and dust. This was a remarkable piece of scientific speculation, anticipating later developments in astronomy, showing Kant's ability to think imaginatively about physical processes while remaining constrained by mathematical and physical principles. The work attracted little immediate attention, partly because the publisher went bankrupt shortly after its release, but it demonstrated the scope and originality of Kant's thinking about the natural world. Other works from this period addressed questions about the nature of space and time, about the principles of natural philosophy, about the relationship between physical and metaphysical explanations. Kant was searching for a coherent framework that could do justice to both the success of Newtonian physics and the traditional concerns of metaphysics. He was increasingly convinced that previous attempts to reconcile these domains had been unsatisfactory, but he had not yet found his own solution. The 1760s were sometimes called Kant's silent decade, though this is somewhat misleading. He published less during this period, but he was intensely active intellectually, teaching his full range of courses, reading extensively, rethinking fundamental questions about knowledge and metaphysics. He was becoming dissatisfied with the rationalist philosophy in which he had been trained, increasingly influenced by the empiricism of British philosophers like Locke and Hume, but not ready to embrace empiricism fully either. He was searching for a middle path, a way to acknowledge the importance of sensory experience in knowledge, while also preserving a role for reason and for a priori concepts. During these years, he was also maturing as a person, moving from young adulthood into middle age, becoming more confident in his own judgment, more willing to think independently of established authorities, more aware of the significance of the questions he was pursuing. He was still waiting for a permanent university position, still dependent on student fees for his livelihood, still living modestly in rented rooms. But he was no longer the uncertain young man who had returned to Königsberg in 1755. He was an established lecturer, a recognized member of the university community, a scholar whose work was beginning to be noticed beyond his immediate circle. The routines of his life had become deeply ingrained. The early rising, the morning work, the midday meal at a specific time, the afternoon lectures and walk, the evening engagements or further work, the regular bedtime. These patterns were not arbitrary. They were the structure within which his intellectual life could flourish, the framework that made sustained concentration possible. He had learned through experience what conditions allowed him to think most effectively, and he had organized his life to create and maintain those conditions. The city around him continued its own rhythms, indifferent to his concerns, but providing the stable environment he needed. The river flowed, the ships came and went, the markets operated, the churches held their services, the university conducted its business. The seasons turned in their endless cycle, winter giving way to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, autumn to winter again. The bridges stood solid across the water, the streets wound through their familiar courses, the buildings maintained their accustomed places. Kant had become a part of this urban landscape, as much a fixture of Königsberg as its churches, or its university, or its river. People knew him by sight, knew his habits, expected to see him at certain times in certain places. There was something reassuring about this regularity, both for Kant himself and for those who observed him. In a world that could seem chaotic and unpredictable, here was constancy, here was order, here was the proof that a life could be organized according to rational principles, that discipline and routine could create the conditions for meaningful work. Part 6. There are lives that organize themselves around quiet certainties, around the belief that order creates freedom rather than constraining it, that discipline opens possibilities rather than closing them. Kant's life became such a life, structured with a precision that seemed almost mechanical, but that served purposes both practical and philosophical. The famous routine that governed his days was not merely habit or eccentricity. It was a deliberate construction, a framework within which his mind could operate most effectively, within which the demanding work of systematic thinking could be sustained over decades. He rose each morning at 5 o'clock, winter and summer alike, with a punctuality that did not require an alarm. His body had learned the rhythm, had internalized the schedule so completely that waking came naturally at the appointed hour. The first action of the day was to drink a cup or two of weak tea, the only nourishment he took before beginning his work. His servant would have prepared this the night before, knowing the routine, understanding the importance of these small provisions to the master's comfort. The hours between 5 and 7 were dedicated entirely to his own work, to the reading and thinking and writing that constituted his real intellectual labor. He worked at his desk, sitting upright, often in the same clothes he had slept in initially, adding layers as needed against the cold that was especially pronounced in the early morning during the long Königsberg winters. These were quiet hours, when the city was still largely asleep, when there were no interruptions, no demands, when consciousness was fresh and the mind could engage with difficult questions without distraction. He wrote carefully, methodically, filling pages with his neat handwriting, crossing out and revising, working through arguments step by step, examining them from different angles, testing them against objections. He read with similar care, marking passages in the books that lined his shelves, making notes in margins, copying out quotations that seemed particularly significant. The work was slow, painstaking, not dramatic or obviously productive in any immediate sense. But it was cumulative, each day's work building on the previous day's, each month advancing understanding incrementally, each year contributing to the larger project that was gradually taking shape. At 7 o'clock, he prepared for the day's teaching, dressing carefully in his professional attire, reviewing the notes for his morning lecture. By about 8, he would leave his lodgings and walk to the university, arriving in time for a 9 o'clock lecture. He typically taught 2 hours in the morning, from 9 to 11, covering whatever subjects were scheduled for that day. The lectures were delivered from notes rather than read from a prepared text, allowing for some spontaneity and responsiveness to student questions while maintaining the systematic organization he valued. After the morning lectures, he returned home for his midday meal, which he took around 1 o'clock. This was the main meal of the day, and Kant did not usually eat alone. He regularly invited friends or colleagues to dine with him, or he was invited to dine at their homes. These meals were social occasions, opportunities for conversation and companionship, and they could extend for several hours. Kant was known to be an excellent host and an engaging dinner companion, able to discuss a wide range of topics with knowledge and wit, to make his guests feel welcome and valued. The conversation at these meals ranged widely: current events, scientific discoveries, philosophical questions, literary works, political developments, local gossip, all were fair game. Kant didn't dominate the conversation, but participated actively, asking questions, offering observations, sometimes telling stories or making jokes. He believed that conversation was important not only for social reasons, but also as a form of mental exercise, a way of testing ideas in a less formal context than academic writing, a way of learning how others thought about the questions that occupied him. Food was important to Kant, but not as an indulgence. He ate moderately, was careful about what he consumed, believed that diet affected both physical health and mental clarity. He avoided heavy meals that might make him sluggish, preferred simple preparations to elaborate cuisine, drank wine in moderation. The meal was an occasion for nourishment in multiple senses: physical sustenance, social connection, intellectual stimulation. After the meal and the conversation had concluded, typically by mid-afternoon, Kant took his famous walk. This was perhaps the most iconic element of his routine, the habit that became legendary among his neighbors. He walked for approximately an hour, following a route that became so invariable that people in Königsberg reportedly set their clocks by his passage. He walked alone, maintaining a steady pace, his focus directed toward a fixed point ahead, often a church tower or other landmark. His thoughts turned inward even as his body moved through the streets. The walk served multiple purposes. It was exercise, important for someone who spent most of his time sitting at a desk or standing in a classroom. It was fresh air and exposure to the outdoors, a break from the confines of rooms and buildings. But most importantly, it was thinking time, perhaps the most productive thinking time of the day. There was something about the rhythm of walking, about the physical movement combined with the visual constancy of focusing on a distant point that facilitated deep thought. Problems that had seemed intractable at the desk would sometimes resolve themselves during the walk. Connections that had eluded him would suddenly become clear. Arguments would organize themselves. Objections would suggest their own answers. The route itself was familiar to the point of being automatic. He did not need to think about where to turn or what street to take next. His feet knew the way, allowing his conscious mind to be entirely occupied with whatever question was at hand. The sights along the route were familiar, too, so familiar that they became almost invisible, part of the unchanging background against which his thoughts unfolded. Only dramatic changes in the environment would interrupt this mental focus, would draw his attention back to his physical surroundings. There is a famous story, perhaps apocryphal, but telling nonetheless, that Kant once became so absorbed in thought during his walk that he failed to notice that the city had planted a row of linden trees along part of his route. When he finally did notice them, weeks later, he was reportedly quite disturbed by the alteration to the familiar landscape. Whether or not the story is true, it captures something essential about how Kant used his walks, about the degree to which they were mental rather than physical journeys. After the walk, the late afternoon and evening hours were given to various activities, depending on the day and the season. Sometimes there were more lectures to deliver. Sometimes there was reading or correspondence to attend to. Often there were social engagements, visits with friends, attendance at gatherings or meetings of the reading society to which he belonged. But whatever the specific activities, Kant maintained the discipline of retiring relatively early, typically around 10 o'clock, ensuring that he would get sufficient sleep to rise refreshed at 5 the next morning. Bedtime preparations followed their own ritual. He would ready himself methodically, putting his clothing in order for the next day, making sure everything was in its place, preparing the conditions for a good night's rest. Sleep did not always come easily for Kant, who struggled with insomnia at various points in his life, but he had developed techniques for encouraging it, mental exercises, specific ways of lying, deliberate regulation of breathing. He believed that sleep was crucial for health and for mental functioning, and he treated it with the same seriousness he brought to his work. This routine, established in broad outline during his years as a lecturer and refined over time, remained remarkably consistent for decades. There were variations when necessary, accommodations to unusual circumstances, but the basic structure persisted. It provided predictability, created optimal conditions for concentration, minimized the need to make decisions about mundane matters, freeing mental energy for more important questions. The discipline required to maintain such a routine was considerable. It meant refusing many temptations and distractions, meant prioritizing his work above other possible pleasures or pursuits, meant accepting a certain narrowness in his daily experience. But Kant saw this not as sacrifice, but as choice, as the rational organization of life in service of the ends he valued most. Freedom, in his developing philosophy, was not the absence of constraint, but the autonomous determination of one's own actions according to rational principles. His routine was an expression of this freedom, a way of living according to principles he had chosen for himself. The city participated in this routine, provided the stable environment within which it could function. The church bells marked the hours, providing auditory confirmation of time's passage. The streets remained essentially unchanged, allowing for the familiar walk. The university maintained its schedule, creating the framework for his teaching obligations. The social life of Königsberg's educated class provided the companions for his meals and conversations. Everything fit together, each element supporting the others. Kant's rooms, wherever he lived during these years, reflected the same values of order and simplicity. There was a place for everything, and everything was kept in its place. Books were shelved systematically, papers organized, furniture arranged for maximum utility. There was no clutter, no unnecessary decoration, nothing that did not serve a purpose. The space was not austere in a harsh sense, but it was certainly spare, focused on function rather than comfort or display. His servant, a man named Lampe, who would remain in Kant's employ for many years, learned to accommodate the master's habits, to provide what was needed when it was needed, to maintain the household in the orderly state that Kant required. Lampe was not merely a domestic employee, but became part of the stable structure of Kant's life. A familiar presence, someone who understood without needing extensive explanation what the routine demanded. Clothing was another arena of routine. Kant dressed appropriately for his position in the sober academic style of the time, but without particular attention to fashion or elegance. He owned multiple similar outfits, so that the choice of what to wear each day was simplified. The clothes were of good quality, well maintained, but not distinctive. The goal was to be properly dressed without having to think about it, to have one less decision to make each morning. Food followed patterns as well. Kant had preferences and aversions, things he found agreed with him, and things that did not. These were respected in the planning of meals, creating consistency and predictability. He was not particularly adventurous in his eating habits, content with familiar dishes prepared in familiar ways. The variety in his meals came from the conversation and company rather than from the cuisine itself. Even recreation, such as it was, fell into patterns. The evening social engagements occurred on certain days of the week. The reading society met at regular intervals. Visits with particular friends followed predictable schedules. This was not rigid to the point of inflexibility, but there was a structure, a general expectation about how different kinds of activities were distributed across the week and the month and the year. The routine was most strictly maintained during the academic term, when teaching obligations provided external structure. During breaks in the university schedule, there was somewhat more flexibility, though the basic rhythms of rising and working and walking persisted. Kant used these periods for more intensive reading and writing, for making progress on larger projects that could not be completed in the fragments of time available during the teaching term. His health benefited from this regularity. The chronic minor ailments that had troubled his youth were managed effectively through consistent habits. He found that his digestion was better when he ate at the same times each day, that he slept more easily when he maintained regular hours, that his overall energy and mental clarity were higher when his days followed a predictable pattern. The routine was not a burden to be endured, but a support that made everything else possible. There was also a philosophical dimension to this way of living. Kant was developing ideas about autonomy, about rational self-determination, about duty and morality. He believed that human beings were not mere creatures of appetite and impulse, but rational agents capable of governing themselves according to principles. His own life was an attempt to embody this ideal, to demonstrate that one could live according to reason, that discipline and order were expressions of freedom rather than denials of it. The routine became so well established, so thoroughly integrated into his life and into the life of the city around him, that it seemed almost natural, almost inevitable. But it was neither. It was chosen, maintained through constant small acts of will, through the daily decision to rise at 5 rather than sleeping longer, to work rather than idling, to walk rather than resting, to retire early rather than extending the evening's pleasures. These choices, repeated day after day, year after year, created a life of remarkable productivity and consistency, a life organized around intellectual work and sustained by habits that made that work possible. Part 7. The 18th century was an age of transformation in European thought, a period when long-established certainties were being questioned and new frameworks for understanding the world were being proposed and debated. This intellectual ferment, later called the Enlightenment, was characterized by confidence in reason, by a belief that human beings could understand nature and society through systematic inquiry, by a questioning of traditional authorities, whether in politics, religion, or philosophy. Centers of this movement were Paris and London, Edinburgh and Amsterdam, cities where salons and coffeehouses and scientific societies provided venues for the exchange of ideas, where publishers produced books and journals that circulated new thinking across Europe and beyond. Königsberg was not at the center of these developments. It was a provincial city in a northern corner of the German-speaking world, distant from the great metropolitan centers where the Enlightenment was most visibly flourishing. Yet even here, even in this remote location, the new ideas arrived and were discussed, debated, absorbed. Books made their way to Königsberg through the commercial networks that linked the city to other parts of Europe. University faculty and educated residents read the latest publications from France and England, discussed the ideas of Voltaire and Rousseau, of Locke and Hume, of the French encyclopedists and the Scottish moral philosophers. Kant was an active participant in this intellectual culture, both as a consumer and eventually as a contributor. He read widely in contemporary philosophy and science, following developments across multiple fields, absorbing new arguments and evidence, thinking about how they related to questions that concerned him. His own location in Königsberg, far from the centers of fashion and influence, had certain advantages. He was insulated from some of the more superficial aspects of intellectual fashion, free to develop his own thinking without the pressure to conform to what was currently popular in Paris or London. He could take his time, could work through problems carefully, and, systematically, could arrive at conclusions based on thorough analysis rather than on the need to participate in current debates. The Enlightenment emphasis on reason appealed to Kant deeply. The idea that human beings could understand the world through careful observation and logical analysis, that knowledge was not simply handed down by authority, but could be discovered and verified, that intellectual progress was possible. These were convictions he shared fully. But he was also aware of limitations and dangers in the Enlightenment project as it was being pursued by some of its advocates. There was a tendency toward overconfidence, toward assuming that reason alone could answer all questions, toward dismissing too quickly the insights of tradition and religion. French Enlightenment thought, as exemplified by writers like Voltaire, tended toward a certain witty skepticism, a questioning of established institutions and beliefs, a confidence that human affairs could be reorganized along more rational lines. Kant appreciated the critical impulse, but was wary of what he saw as superficiality, a tendency to tear down without constructing anything solid in place of what was demolished. The French philosophe seemed to him sometimes more interested in being clever than in being careful, more concerned with effect than with truth. British empiricism, represented by philosophers like John Locke, George Berkeley, and especially David Hume, posed different challenges and opportunities. These thinkers emphasized the role of sensory experience in knowledge, arguing that all our ideas derive ultimately from impressions received through the senses. This was a powerful critique of the rationalist tradition, which had claimed that reason alone could discover fundamental truths about reality. Hume, in particular, had pushed empiricism to conclusions that seemed to undermine the very possibility of certain knowledge, arguing that claims about causation, about the self, about the external world could not be justified on purely empirical grounds. Kant read Hume carefully and was profoundly influenced by him. Later, he would say that Hume had awakened him from his dogmatic slumber, had forced him to recognize the inadequacy of the rationalist philosophy he had been taught. But Kant was not satisfied with Hume's conclusions either. If Hume was right, if empiricism led to skepticism about the possibility of genuine knowledge, then something had gone wrong. The success of mathematics and Newtonian physics could not be denied, yet Hume's philosophy seemed unable to account for this success, seemed to reduce scientific knowledge to mere habit or custom. German philosophy in Kant's time was still dominated by the rationalist systems of Leibniz and Wolff, comprehensive frameworks that attempted to explain all of reality through the systematic application of reason. Kant had been trained in this tradition, had absorbed its methods and its confidence in the power of rational analysis, but he was increasingly convinced that this approach was inadequate, that it claimed to know things that could not actually be known through pure reason alone, that it confused conceptual analysis with genuine insight into reality. What was needed, Kant became convinced, was a new approach, one that could acknowledge the importance of sensory experience emphasized by the empiricists, while also preserving a role for reason and for knowledge that was not merely empirical. He needed to find a way to explain how mathematics and physics could be genuinely informative about the world, while not being based solely on experience, how certain kinds of knowledge could be both necessary and universal, while still being connected to the empirical world. This project that would occupy him for years, would require working through problem after problem, would demand clarity about questions that previous philosophers had not even recognized as questions. What are the conditions that make experience possible? How does the mind organize sensory impressions into coherent experience? What can we know a priori, independent of experience, and how is such knowledge possible? What are the limits of human knowledge, and what lies beyond those limits? Kant worked on these questions during the 1760s and into the 1770s, thinking through them during his solitary morning hours of work, during his walks, in the margins of his lecture preparations. He was not in a hurry to publish. He wanted to be sure he had found the right approach, that his answers were well-grounded and systematic, that he could defend them against objections. The academic world could wait. What mattered was getting it right. The intellectual climate of the Enlightenment provided both resources and challenges for this work. The emphasis on reason and systematic inquiry, the confidence that fundamental questions could be answered through careful thought, the willingness to question, established authorities, all of these were helpful. But the particular forms that Enlightenment thinking was taking in different places and among different thinkers also revealed problems that needed to be addressed, showed the inadequacy of existing approaches, made clear that something new was required. Kant's teaching continued to expose him to the full range of philosophical questions and positions. In preparing his lectures, he had to engage with different schools of thought, present them fairly to his students, consider their strengths and weaknesses. This pedagogical work fed into his own thinking, forced him to articulate clearly what he found persuasive and what problematic in various approaches, helped him to see connections and conflicts that might not have been apparent otherwise. His social interactions also contributed to this process. In conversations with educated friends and colleagues, he could test ideas informally, gauge reactions, think aloud in a way that was not possible in solitary work. These conversations were not research in any formal sense, but they were part of the intellectual environment within which his thinking developed, part of how ideas were refined and clarified. Königsberg itself, despite its distance from the major centers of Enlightenment activity, had certain advantages as a location for this work. The university provided institutional support and a community of scholars. The city's commercial connections ensured that books and journals from across Europe were available. The educated public provided an audience for ideas, people who cared about philosophical questions and who could engage with them seriously. And the relative isolation meant that Kant could work at his own pace, according to his own standards, without the pressures that might have existed in a more competitive and fashionable environment. The political context of Enlightenment thought was also relevant. Many Enlightenment thinkers were concerned with questions of political organization, with issues of justice and rights, with the proper relationship between government and governed. These were not abstract theoretical questions, but matters with practical significance, touching on how societies should be organized, what freedoms individuals should enjoy, what responsibilities they bore toward one another and toward the state. Kant was interested in these questions too, though his engagement with them was more measured and cautious than that of some Enlightenment thinkers. He lived under a monarchy, in a state where political discussion had limits, where certain kinds of criticism could bring unwelcome attention from authorities. He was also temperamentally inclined toward order and stability, skeptical of revolutionary change, convinced that social transformation needed to proceed gradually and through rational reform rather than sudden upheaval. His political thinking, which would develop more fully in later years, reflected his broader philosophical commitments. He believed in human dignity, in the moral equality of rational beings, in the importance of freedom understood as autonomy, as the capacity to govern oneself according to rational principles. These ideas had radical implications, though Kant did not always pursue them to their radical conclusions. They suggested that legitimate government must respect the rationality and autonomy of citizens, that laws must be capable of being accepted by free rational beings, that political authority could not rest merely on force or tradition, but required rational justification. The Enlightenment ideal of progress, the belief that human knowledge and human society could be improved through reason and effort, was one that Kant shared, though with qualifications. He believed that progress was possible, that over time human understanding could deepen and human institutions could become more rational and just. But he also recognized obstacles to progress, ways in which human nature could resist or subvert rational reform, ways in which good intentions could produce unintended consequences. Progress was possible, but not inevitable, required sustained effort and commitment, could be interrupted or reversed. Religious enlightenment, the attempt to bring reason to bear on questions of faith and revelation, to separate authentic religion from superstition and dogma, was another aspect of the broader movement. Kant was sympathetic to this project, believing that religion should be rational, that it should focus on moral conduct rather than on doctrinal niceties or ritual observances. The pietism of his youth had emphasized the moral dimension of faith, the importance of living rightly rather than merely believing correctly, and this resonated with his developing philosophical views. But Kant was also convinced that reason had limits, that there were questions it could not answer, areas where knowledge in the strict sense was not possible. The existence of God, the immortality of the soul, the ultimate meaning of existence, these were matters that could not be proven or disproven through theoretical reason. Yet they remained important, perhaps even necessary, for moral life and for human hope. Finding a way to acknowledge both the limits of knowledge and the legitimacy of faith would become an important part of his philosophical project. The broader cultural context of the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on cultivation and refinement, on education and improvement, on the development of human capacities, also shaped Kant's thinking. He believed in the importance of education, in the possibility of cultivating rationality and moral character, in the responsibility of each generation to pass on knowledge and to prepare the next generation for the work of continuing human progress. His lectures on pedagogy reflected these concerns, addressing questions about how children should be educated, what virtues should be cultivated, how rational autonomy could be developed. The Enlightenment was also an age of sociability, of salons and coffee houses and learned societies where ideas were exchanged in conversation and correspondence. Kant participated in this culture through his regular dinner gatherings, through his membership in reading societies, through his correspondence with other scholars. These social dimensions of intellectual life were important, providing the networks through which ideas circulated, the audiences for whom one wrote, the interlocutors against whom arguments were tested. As the 1770s progressed, Kant was moving toward the breakthrough that would eventually produce his most important work. He was clarifying his questions, developing his distinctive approach, recognizing both what previous philosophers had accomplished and where they had gone wrong. The Enlightenment provided the context for this work, the intellectual resources, and the cultural support, the sense that fundamental questions could be addressed systematically, and that the answers mattered for how human beings understood themselves and organized their lives. Kant was both a product of the Enlightenment and one of its most important contributors, someone who took its central commitments seriously enough to examine them critically and to reformulate them on more secure foundations. Part 8. The work that would transform philosophy and secure Kant's lasting reputation was a long time in preparation. The critique of pure reason, as it would eventually be titled, occupied him intensively for the better part of a decade, though the groundwork for it extended back even further, into the years when he was first wrestling with the problems posed by empiricism and rationalism, first recognizing that a new approach was needed. Writing the critique was not a straightforward process of composition. It involved false starts and revisions, periods of intense productivity, and periods of doubt. The slow clarification of ideas and arguments that were complex and difficult, even for Kant himself to express adequately. The fundamental question the critique addressed was one that had preoccupied Kant for years. How is synthetic a priori knowledge possible? This technical formulation conceals a profound puzzle. Some knowledge is analytic, true by definition, like the claim that all bachelors are unmarried. Such knowledge is certain but uninformative, merely unpacking what is already contained in concepts. Other knowledge is synthetic, making claims that go beyond mere definitions, like the claim that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Such knowledge is informative, but depends on experience, on empirical observation. But mathematics and physics seem to involve a third kind of knowledge, synthetic, genuinely informative, but also a priori, known independent of experience, necessary and universal in a way that empirical generalizations are not. How could this be? How could we know things about the world with certainty, independent of experience? The rationalists had claimed that pure reason could discover truths about reality, but this seemed to Kant to be overconfident, to claim knowledge that went beyond what could actually be justified. The empiricists had claimed that all substantive knowledge came from experience, but this seemed to make the certainty and universality of mathematics and physics mysterious, to reduce them to mere generalizations from experience. Neither approach was satisfactory. Kant's revolutionary insight, gradually developed and refined over years of thought, was that the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge could be explained by recognizing that the mind itself contributes to the structure of experience. We do not simply receive sensory impressions passively, like a blank slate being written upon. Instead, the mind actively organizes those impressions according to its own forms and categories, making coherent experience possible. Space and time are not properties of things in themselves, but forms through which we necessarily experience things. Causation, substance, unity. These two are concepts that the mind brings to experience rather than extracting from it. This meant that what we know is not things as they are in themselves, independent of our experience of them, but rather things as they appear to us, structured by the necessary conditions of possible experience. We can have certain knowledge about objects of experience because that knowledge reflects the very conditions that make experience possible. Mathematics describes the forms of our sensory intuition, space and time. Physics employs the categories through which we necessarily think about objects. This knowledge is secure precisely because it is knowledge about the structure of experience, not about some transcendent reality beyond experience. This approach had profound implications. It meant that certain traditional metaphysical questions about God and the soul, and free will, and the ultimate nature of reality, could not be answered by theoretical reason. These questions concerned things beyond possible experience, things in themselves rather than appearances, and about such matters we could have no knowledge in the strict sense. This was not skepticism, not a denial that such things existed or that such questions mattered. It was rather a clear delineation of the limits of what could be known theoretically, a recognition that reason overreaches when it tries to extend beyond the conditions of a possible experience. But if theoretical reason had limits, practical reason, the use of reason to guide action, operated in a different domain. Here, Kant believed, we had to presuppose freedom, had to assume that human beings were not merely natural objects determined by causal laws, but also rational agents capable of self-determination. Morality required this presupposition, and morality was a fact of human life, something given in the consciousness of duty, in the awareness that certain actions were right and others wrong, regardless of their consequences. These ideas were revolutionary, but they were also extraordinarily difficult to express clearly. Kant wrote and rewrote, trying to find the right formulations, the clearest explanations, the most compelling arguments. He created new technical vocabulary, introduced distinctions that had not been made before, developed systematic frameworks for organizing his insights. The work was demanding intellectually, requiring sustained concentration over long periods, requiring him to hold complex arguments in mind while examining them from multiple angles. He worked on the critique primarily during his morning hours, those precious early hours when his mind was freshest and the demands of the day had not yet begun. He would sit at his desk, writing in his careful hand, filling page after page, organizing his thoughts into sections and chapters, developing the systematic architecture that would hold the work together. The physical act of writing was itself part of the thinking process, not merely the recording of thoughts already complete, but the working out of ideas through their expression in words. There were periods when the work went well, when arguments fell into place, when sections would write themselves almost effortlessly. There were other periods when everything seemed difficult, when formulations that had seemed clear revealed themselves to be inadequate, when objections arose that required substantial rethinking. Kant persevered through both kinds of periods, trusting in the value of the project, committed to seeing it through to completion, even when the end seemed distant. His teaching continued throughout this period, and this presented both challenges and opportunities. The lectures took time and energy, demanded preparation and attention, pulled him away from his writing. But they also kept him engaged with the full range of philosophical questions, forced him to explain ideas clearly to students, provided feedback about what was persuasive and what was not. The distinction between his public teaching and his private research was not absolute. Ideas developed in one context would inform the other, creating a productive dialectic between pedagogy and original investigation. The social dimension of his life also continued, providing necessary breaks from the intensity of his work, maintaining connections with friends and colleagues, ensuring that he did not become entirely isolated in his scholarly labors. The dinner conversations, the gatherings at the reading society, the correspondence with other scholars, all of these remained important, providing perspectives and insights that enriched his thinking even when they were not directly focused on the specific problems he was addressing in his writing. Kant was in his 50s during the intensive period of writing the Critique, an age when many scholars have completed their most important work. But for him, this was just the beginning of his mature philosophical production. The years of preparation, the teaching experience, the engagement with other thinkers, the careful working through of problems, all of this was coming together, finding expression in a work of systematic philosophy unlike anything that had come before. The first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason was published in 1781, when Kant was 57 years old. It was a substantial book, dense and difficult, filled with technical terminology and complex arguments. Kant knew it would not be easy for readers, but he believed the difficulty was necessary, that the questions he was addressing and the solutions he was proposing required careful, systematic exposition. He could not simplify without distorting, could not make it popular without sacrificing precision. The initial reception of the critique was limited. It was reviewed in a few journals, but many reviewers admitted to finding it difficult to understand, to being uncertain about what exactly Kant was claiming. Some dismissed it as obscure German metaphysics, unnecessarily complicated. Others recognized that something important was being attempted, but were not sure whether the attempt was successful. There was not immediate, widespread enthusiasm or recognition of the work's significance. This must have been disappointing to Kant, who had invested so much effort in the work, who believed he had found solutions to fundamental problems that had vexed philosophy for centuries. But he did not respond with bitterness or defensiveness. Instead, he set about trying to make his ideas clearer, writing shorter works that would explain the critique's main points in more accessible terms, addressing misunderstandings that had appeared in the reviews, continuing to develop and refine his philosophical system. One source of difficulty for readers was the writing itself. Kant's prose in the critique was not elegant or flowing. Sentences could be extremely long and syntactically complex, filled with qualifications and subclauses, demanding close attention and often requiring multiple readings to pass correctly. He employed a specialized vocabulary, introducing technical terms that needed to be mastered before the arguments could be followed. The overall structure of the work was systematic, but also intricate, with multiple levels of organization and with arguments that built on earlier sections in ways that were not always immediately clear. Yet beneath the difficult surface was a work of remarkable ambition and originality. Kant was not merely offering new answers to old questions. He was reconceiving what philosophy could and should do, was establishing new questions and new methods, was creating a framework within which subsequent philosophical work would largely proceed, whether in agreement or in opposition to his conclusions. The years immediately following the publication of the critique were devoted to elaboration and clarification. Kant wrote the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, a shorter work that attempted to present the critique's main ideas in a more accessible form. He began work on what would become the Critique of Practical Reason, extending his systematic philosophy to ethics and moral theory. He wrote the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, laying out the foundations of his moral philosophy. He continued to lecture, to participate in the intellectual life of Königsberg, to maintain the routines that had served him well for decades. He also prepared a second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1787, in which he revised and clarified various sections, responded to criticisms, attempted to make his arguments more accessible without compromising their rigor. This second edition became the standard version, the text through which most readers would encounter his critical philosophy. The existence of two editions, with significant differences between them, would later create interpretive challenges for scholars trying to understand exactly what Kant meant. But for Kant himself, the revisions were simply part of the ongoing work of getting his ideas right, of expressing them as clearly as possible. The writing of these major works required not only intellectual capacity, but also physical stamina and disciplined work habits. Kant was not a robust man, was increasingly troubled by various health complaints, needed to manage his time and energy carefully to sustain the productivity his philosophical projects demanded. The routines he had established were essential in this respect, creating the conditions under which sustained intellectual work was possible despite physical limitations. The work itself had a quality of necessity for Kant. He was not writing to gain fame or to advance his career, though he certainly hoped his work would be recognized and valued. He was writing because he believed he had important things to say, because he had found solutions to problems that others had not solved, because the questions he was addressing mattered fundamentally for how human beings understood themselves and their place in the world. The work was its own justification, its own reward, even when recognition was slow in coming. Part 9. The moral philosophy that Kant developed in the years following the Critique of Pure Reason was not an afterthought or a secondary concern. It was, in many ways, the heart of his entire philosophical project. He had argued in the Critique that theoretical reason could not prove the existence of God, or the immortality of the soul, or the freedom of the will, that these matters lay beyond the limits of possible knowledge. But he had also suggested that practical reason, the use of reason to guide action, required presupposing these very things. Morality made sense only if human beings were free, capable of choosing to act according to duty rather than being wholly determined by natural causes and inclinations. The question then was what morality actually required, how the moral law could be understood and articulated, how duty could be distinguished from mere inclination or social convention. Kant's answer, developed most fully in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals and the critique of practical reason, was as revolutionary in ethics as his critical philosophy had been in epistemology and metaphysics. He proposed that morality was not based on consequences, or on feelings, or on divine commands, or on social agreement, but on reason itself, on the form of rational willing. The central concept was autonomy, the capacity of rational beings to give law to themselves, to act according to principles they could recognize as valid for all rational beings. A moral action was one performed from duty, from respect for the moral law, rather than from inclination or self-interest. The moral law itself could be expressed in what Kant called the categorical imperative, a principle that commanded unconditionally, regardless of one's desires or goals. Kant formulated the categorical imperative in several ways, each highlighting a different aspect of moral reasoning. The first formulation was, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. This meant that before acting, one should consider the principle or maxim underlying the action, and ask whether one could consistently will that everyone act on that principle. If universalizing the maxim led to contradiction or to a state of affairs one could not rationally will, then the action was morally impermissible. This was not a consequentialist calculation about what would produce the best outcomes if everyone acted in a certain way. It was rather a test of rational consistency, of whether one's maxim could coherently serve as a universal law for all rational beings. The point was to identify actions motivated by mere self-interest or by principles that depended on others not following them, to distinguish genuine moral principles from self-serving rationalizations. A second formulation of the categorical imperative focused on the inherent dignity of rational beings. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end in itself. This formulation emphasized that moral action required respecting the rationality and autonomy of all persons, recognizing them as valuable in themselves rather than merely as instruments for achieving one's own purposes. These principles were demanding. They required a kind of moral seriousness, an attention to the motives and principles underlying action, a willingness to subject one's conduct to rational scrutiny. They ruled out many actions that might seem acceptable if judged only by their consequences or by whether they violated explicit rules. An action might produce good results and might not break any laws, but if it was performed from self-interest rather than from duty, if it treated others merely as means, if its maxim could not be universalized, then it lacked genuine moral worth. Kant illustrated these principles through examples, some more convincing than others, all intended to show how the categorical imperative applied to concrete situations. He discussed promises and lying, helping others, and developing one's own talents, treating oneself and treating others. In each case, he tried to show how the categorical imperative provided clear guidance, how reason alone could determine what morality, continue 1858, required. For Kant, this approach to ethics was liberating rather than constraining. Because morality was based on reason rather than on authority or custom or feeling, rational beings could recognize moral requirements for themselves, could be autonomous, self-legislating. One did not need to rely on external sources to tell one what was right. One could figure it out through one's own rational reflection. And because all rational beings shared the same reason, the same capacity for moral thought, morality was universal, the same for all people, regardless of their particular circumstances or cultural background. This universalism was important to Kant. He believed that human beings, whatever their differences in talent or education or social position, shared a fundamental moral equality as rational beings. Each person had inherent dignity, deserved respect, could not be treated merely as a means to others' ends. This was a radical idea in many contexts, challenging hierarchical social arrangements, questioning institutions that treated some people as having less moral worth than others. But Kant's ethics also had a strongly individualistic dimension. Moral worth belonged to the individual will, to the choice to act from duty. One could not be made moral by external force or by social conditioning. Morality required autonomy, the self-determination of the rational will. This meant that while moral principles were universal, moral action was deeply personal, a matter of individual conscience and commitment. The relationship between duty and inclination was complex in Kant's ethics. He did not deny that human beings had natural inclinations, desires and feelings that moved them to act in various ways. What he insisted was that moral worth attached only to actions done from duty, from respect for the moral law, rather than from inclination. An action might accord with duty while being motivated by inclination, and such actions were permitted, even valuable. But they did not have the special worth that attached to actions done purely from duty, from the recognition of what morality required, regardless of one's desires. This led to what some readers found to be a harsh or overly demanding picture of morality. Kant seemed to be saying that if you helped someone because you felt sympathy for them, because it made you feel good to help, this had less moral worth than helping from duty even when you felt no sympathy. The person who struggled against inclination to do what duty required was morally superior to the person who did the same action easily and naturally out of good feeling. Kant's point was not that feelings were bad or should be suppressed, but rather that morality could not be based on them. Feelings were unreliable, varied from person to person, could be manipulated or distorted. A morality based on feeling would be subjective, unstable, unable to provide the kind of universal and necessary principles that morality seemed to require. Only reason could provide such principles, and therefore moral worth had to attach to the rational will, to the choice to act from duty, independent of whatever feelings might be present. This emphasis on duty was connected to Kant's own life and character. Had been raised in a pietist household where duty and moral seriousness were central. His own life was ordered by discipline and routine, by the choice to live according to principles he had determined for himself. His philosophy of morality was, in some sense, a rationalization and universalization of the way he had learned to live, a translation of pietist moral earnestness into philosophical terms accessible to reason rather than dependent on religious faith. But Kant believed he was not merely projecting his own preferences onto morality. He was uncovering what morality actually was, what rational beings everywhere would recognize as binding when they reflected carefully on moral questions. The categorical imperative was not his invention, but his discovery, the articulation in clear terms of what had always been implicit in moral consciousness. The implications of this ethics extended to questions of justice and politics. If all rational beings had inherent dignity, if they were ends in themselves and never merely means, then political institutions and laws had to respect this dignity. Legitimate government could not treat citizens as mere instruments of state purposes. Laws had to be such that free rational beings could accept them, could see them as consistent with their own autonomy rather than as merely external impositions. Kant developed these political ideas in various works, arguing for republican government, for the rule of law, for the importance of civil liberties, for the possibility of perpetual peace through a federation of free states. These were radical ideas in his time, though Kant expressed them cautiously, aware of the political constraints under which he lived, unwilling to advocate revolutionary change, but committed to the principle that political arrangements should reflect the moral equality and autonomy of citizens. His ethics also had implications for how he understood his own vocation as a philosopher and teacher. He believed he had a duty to share what he had learned, to contribute to the moral and intellectual progress of humanity, to help others develop their own rational capacities. Teaching was not merely a job, but a moral responsibility, a way of treating students as ends in themselves by helping them to become more fully autonomous, rational beings. The moral philosophy, like the critical philosophy more broadly, was meant to be systematic and comprehensive. Kant wrote not only about the foundations of ethics, but also about its application to particular domains. He addressed questions about virtue and vice, about duties to oneself and duties to others, about the role of religion in moral life, about education and the cultivation of moral character. He wanted to show that his ethical principles could provide guidance across the full range of human concerns, that they were not merely abstract theory, but had concrete, practical import. In his personal life, Kant tried to live according to his principles, though he would have been the first to acknowledge that perfect moral conduct was difficult and that he, like all human beings, was subject to the temptations of self-interest and the distortions of self-deception. But the attempt to live morally, to act from duty, to respect the dignity of others, to be autonomous and self-determining, this was what gave life meaning and worth. It was what made human beings more than merely clever animals, what connected the mundane activities of daily life to something larger and more significant. The categorical imperative, the emphasis on duty and autonomy, the insistence that morality was based on reason and that all rational beings shared equal moral worth, these ideas would have an enormous influence on subsequent moral and political philosophy. They would be criticized and revised, but they would also inspire, would provide resources for arguments about human rights and social justice, would help to establish moral equality as a baseline assumption of modern ethical thought. For Kant, they were not merely theoretical positions, but truths about the human condition, about what it meant to be a rational being in a world that made moral demands. Part 10, by the late 1780s and into the 1790s, Kant had achieved something unusual for a philosopher: genuine fame. His critiques had begun to attract serious attention, had sparked debates across German universities and beyond, had established him as a major figure in contemporary philosophy. Students came to Königsberg specifically to study with him. Scholars sought his opinions on their work. Publishers wanted to bring out his books. He was no longer simply a respected local professor, but a thinker of European significance, someone whose ideas mattered to the broader intellectual culture. Yet his daily life remained remarkably unchanged. He continued to live in Königsberg, continued to follow the routines he had established decades earlier, continued to teach his courses and to work on his philosophical projects. Fame did not alter the fundamental pattern of his existence. He was not tempted to move to a more prestigious university in a major city, did not seek appointments or honors that would have required leaving the familiar environment of his hometown. Königsberg remained sufficient for his needs, the place where he could work most effectively, where his life made sense. He was now in his 60s, an age when physical decline begins to manifest itself more noticeably, when health concerns become more pressing, when the accumulation of years makes its presence felt in various ways. Kant had never been robust, had managed his health carefully throughout his life. But now the management required more attention, more accommodation. He tired more easily, found sustained work more demanding, needed more time for rest and recovery. The strict routines became even more important, providing the structure within which he could continue to function effectively despite the gradual diminution of physical capacities. His teaching continued, though with some adjustments. The energy required to lecture multiple times each day, to prepare thoroughly for each session, to engage with students, was considerable, and Kant found he needed to be more selective, to limit the number of courses he offered, to husband his resources more carefully. But he did not stop teaching. It remained an important part of his life, a responsibility he took seriously, a connection to the university community and to the next generation of scholars. The philosophical work also continued. He had not said everything he wanted to say in the 3 critiques. There were implications to be worked out, applications to be explored, clarifications to be made. He wrote the Critique of Judgment, completing what he saw as the systematic architecture of his critical philosophy, addressing questions about aesthetics and teleology, about how we experience beauty and understand organic nature. He wrote works on religion, on politics, on anthropology, on the relationship between theory and practice. The productivity was remarkable for someone his age, testament to the effectiveness of the routines and habits he had cultivated. But writing was becoming more difficult. His eyesight was deteriorating, making it harder to read and to write. His hand was less steady, the physical act of forming letters on the page more laborious. He had to work more slowly, to take more breaks, to accept that the hours of continuous concentration he had once enjoyed were no longer possible in the same way. Still, he persisted, driven by the sense that his work was not yet complete, that there were important things still to be said. His social life also began to contract. Some of his oldest friends had died, removing familiar presences from his circle. His own health made it harder to maintain the regular dinner gatherings that had been such a feature of his life. Therefore, walks continued, but became shorter, less regular, as his physical condition made the long, daily constitutional more challenging. The rhythm of his days remained similar in broad outline, but the execution was slower, more effortful, more subject to the limitations that age imposed. In 1796, when Kant was 72, he delivered his last lectures at the university. This was a significant moment, the end of a teaching career that had spanned more than 4 decades, that had touched hundreds or perhaps thousands of students, that had been central to his identity and his daily life. The decision to stop teaching wasn't easy, but it was necessary. He no longer had the stamina to prepare and deliver lectures at the level he demanded of himself, and to continue would have been to offer less than what students deserved. Retirement from teaching allowed him to focus entirely on his writing, at least in theory. In practice, his declining health, and particularly his deteriorating eyesight, made sustained work increasingly difficult. He could still think, could still formulate ideas and arguments, but getting them onto the page in publishable form was becoming a struggle. He relied increasingly on assistance from others, on younger scholars who could help him with research and writing, who could read to him when his eyes failed, who could take dictation when his hand could not manage the pen. The city around him continued its familiar existence, indifferent to his struggles, providing the stable background it had always provided. The river still flowed through its center, the bridges still connected the different quarters, the cathedral bells still rang the towers, the seasons turned with their accustomed rhythm, winter and spring and summer and autumn following one another in endless succession. But Kant's engagement with this world was narrowing, his sphere of activity contracting, his focus increasingly turned inward to the work that remained to be done, and to the management of his declining faculties. Memory was becoming unreliable. Names and dates that he had once recalled easily now eluded him. He would forget what he had been working on, would lose the thread of an argument, would find himself uncertain about what he had already written and what he had merely thought about writing. This was deeply distressing for someone whose entire life had been built on intellectual clarity and systematic thought, whose work demanded precision and careful organization. He struggled against these failures, tried to compensate through notes and outlines, through routines that would help him maintain continuity from one work session to the next. His servant Lampe, who had been with him for many years, remained a constant presence, managing the household, attending to Kant's needs, providing the practical support that allowed him to continue working despite his limitations. There was a famous incident recorded by those who knew Kant in his later years, in which he had to dismiss Lampe for drunkenness or theft or some other transgression, and was so distressed by this necessary action that he left himself a note reading, "Remember to forget Lampe," a poignant indication of how memory was betraying him, how even the decision to forget required assistance from external reminders. Friends visited when they could, maintaining connection, providing companionship, helping with practical matters. Joseph Green, in particular, remained close, managing financial affairs, overseeing the household when Kant was no longer capable of doing so himself, ensuring that the philosopher's declining years were not marked by material hardship or neglect. These friendships, sustained over decades, were among the most valuable things in Kant's life as he aged, proof that his commitment to social connection alongside scholarly work had been wise. The philosophical community continued to engage with his ideas, to debate and criticize and develop them. Younger philosophers were building on his foundations, taking his critical philosophy in new directions, sometimes going beyond what Kant himself had intended or approved. He watched these developments with interest when he was able, pleased that his work was having influence, but also sometimes dismayed by what he saw as misinterpretations or distortions. He tried to respond, to clarify, to indicate where he thought others had gone astray, but the responses were harder to formulate, the arguments harder to articulate clearly. In his mid-70s, Kant was still attempting significant philosophical work. He began a project on what he called the transition from metaphysics to physics, attempting to bridge the gap between his critical philosophy and the concrete science of nature. It was an ambitious undertaking, perhaps too ambitious for someone in his condition, and the work remained fragmentary, never completed to his satisfaction. The pages accumulated, covered with notes and revisions and marginal comments, but they never coalesced into the systematic work he envisioned. The walks, which had been such a central feature of his life for so long, became shorter and less frequent. He could no longer manage the full circuit of his customary route. Sometimes he walked only a short distance, accompanied by a servant or friend, to ensure he did not fall or become disoriented. Sometimes he did not walk at all, the physical demands too great, the benefits too uncertain. This loss was significant, removing one of the main ways he had maintained his health and facilitated his thinking for decades. His appearance changed. The neat professor in his dark academic attire became a frail old man, stooped and slow, his face marked by age, his movements uncertain. People who encountered him on the street might not immediately recognize the famous philosopher, might see only an elderly man struggling with the burden of years. But those who knew him, who had followed his work, or studied with him, recognized the person behind the physical decline, knew that the mind, however diminished, remained engaged with the questions that had occupied a lifetime. He was cared for by a small circle of devoted friends and helpers, people who respected his achievements and wanted to ensure his final years were as comfortable as possible. They managed his affairs, attended to his needs, provided the support that allowed him to maintain some semblance of his accustomed routine, even as his capacities failed. Without this support, his last years would have been much harder, perhaps marked by the kind of neglect and hardship that sometimes befalls the elderly when they can no longer manage their own affairs. The turn of the century, the arrival of the year 1800, found Kant diminished, but still alive, still housed in his familiar city, still surrounded by the landscape and the rhythms he had known for 3/4 of a century. He had lived through enormous intellectual and social changes, had contributed significantly to those changes through his work, had seen his ideas spread across Europe and beyond. But the world was continuing to change, new thinkers were emerging, and Kant himself was being left behind by time, relegated to the status of a predecessor, a foundational figure whose work was essential, but who was no longer at the cutting edge of philosophical development. This is the natural course of things, the way intellectual life proceeds, and Kant, as a rational man, must have understood and accepted it. His work would outlive him, would continue to be read and debated and developed long after he was gone. That was what mattered. That was the contribution he had made. The personal Kant, the man who walked the streets of Königsberg and taught at its university and thought his way through the fundamental questions of philosophy. That man was mortal, subject to age and decline, like all living things. But the ideas, the arguments, the systematic philosophy, these had a different kind of existence, could transcend the limitations of their creator's finite lifespan. Part 11. The first years of the new century brought increasing difficulties. Kant's mental capacities, which had shown signs of deterioration before, were now failing more dramatically and more consistently. The sharp, analytical mind that had grasped and organized such complex arguments, that had seen connections others missed, that had worked through problems with such systematic thoroughness, was becoming clouded, uncertain, unreliable. He would start a thought and lose it midway through. He would repeat himself, telling the same story multiple times without realizing he had already told it. He would become confused about time, about what day it was, about what he had done earlier in the day or the day before. These cognitive failures were distressing not only to Kant, but also to those who cared for him, and who knew what he had been. To watch someone of such intellectual power decline into confusion and forgetfulness was sad in a particularly acute way. It was a reminder of human fragility, of the vulnerability of even the most impressive mental achievements to the simple biological fact of aging and deterioration. The mind that had written the critiques was subject to the same processes of decay as any other mind, was not exempt from the common fate of human consciousness. Despite these difficulties, Kant continued to attempt his accustomed routines. He would rise at the appointed hour, or try to, though sometimes he would become confused about whether it was morning or evening, whether he had already risen or was just going to bed. He would sit at his desk, papers spread before him, trying to work, trying to write, but the coherence was often missing, the sentences fragmenting, the arguments failing to hold together. Friends who visited would find him at his desk, pen in hand, but producing little that was usable, little that showed the clarity and precision that had once characterized everything he wrote. The household continued to function around him, managed by servants and overseen by friends who ensured that his needs were met, that he was fed and clothed and kept comfortable. The rooms remained in their accustomed order. The books still lined the shelves. The desk still stood in its place near the window. But the animating intelligence that had given this space meaning, that had transformed it from mere physical arrangement into a site of intellectual labor, was fading, and the space was becoming just a room where an old man sat, increasingly detached from the world around him. Visitors still came, drawn by respect for what Kant had accomplished, by affection for the man himself, by a sense that his final years should not be marked by isolation or neglect. They would sit with him, attempt conversation, try to engage him with questions about his work or about current events. Sometimes Kant would respond lucidly, would show flashes of the wit and insight that had made him such good company in earlier years. But more often the responses were confused or tangential, the conversation difficult to sustain, the awareness that Kant was struggling to participate painful to witness. The physical decline accompanied the mental deterioration. He became frailer, thinner, more stooped. Walking even short distances became difficult, required assistance. He spent more time sitting or lying down, conserving energy, unable to manage the activities that had once filled his days. The face that looked back from the mirror, when he looked, was that of an old man near the end, the features worn and marked by time, the eyes less alert, the expression often vacant or confused. There was still awareness, at least intermittently, of what was happening to him. In moments of clarity, Kant seems to have recognized his condition, to have understood that his mind was failing, that the intellectual work that had defined his life was no longer possible. These moments must have been difficult, must have brought a kind of grief for the loss of capabilities, for the inability to continue what had mattered most. But they were only moments. Much of the time, the awareness itself was diminished, and perhaps this was a mercy, a protection against the full realization of what age and illness were doing to him. His friends did what they could. They read to him when he could no longer read for himself, when his eyes could not make out the words on the page, or when his mind could not process what he was seeing. They helped him with correspondence, though there was less and less of it, as Kant's ability to compose letters or respond to inquiries faded. They ensured that the routines, as much as possible, were maintained, that meal times remained regular, that the household operated with the order that Kant had always valued even if he could no longer fully participate in maintaining that order himself. The city outside continued its life, indifferent to the drama of one man's decline. Königsberg in the early 1800s was much the same city it had been for decades, the same river and bridges and streets, the same cycle of seasons, the same commercial and educational activities. The university continued to function, new students arrived, and older ones graduated. New professors took up positions, while older ones retired or died. The intellectual life that Kant had been part of went on without him, as it would have to, as it always does. Word had spread in the philosophical community that Kant was in decline, that his mind was failing, that he was no longer capable of the work that had made him famous. This was sad news for those who admired his achievements, for those who had been influenced by his ideas, for those who saw in him a model of what philosophical work could accomplish. But it was also simply a fact to be acknowledged, part of the natural course of things. Great thinkers age and die like everyone else. Their particular gifts and insights no protection against the common fate of mortality. In 1803, when Kant was 79, his condition had deteriorated to the point that he required constant care. He was no longer capable of managing his own affairs, could not be left alone safely, needed help with basic activities of daily life. The household was organized around his care, with servants attending to his needs around the clock, with friends checking in regularly to ensure that everything necessary was being done. It was a kind and attentive care, motivated by genuine affection and respect, ensuring that Kant's final period would be as comfortable and dignified as possible. He had become thin, almost skeletal, eating little, his body consuming itself in the final stages of its existence. Sleep was irregular, sometimes prolonged, sometimes interrupted by periods of restless wakefulness. He would sometimes call out words that made little sense, fragments of thoughts or memories, the mind working in ways that were no longer coherent, but that still produced some kind of output. Those caring for him would respond gently, would try to soothe him, to provide whatever comfort was possible. The seasons continued their cycle around him. Spring of 1804 arrived, the ice breaking up on the river, the gradual warming of the air, the return of light and life to the northern landscape. But for Kant, the seasons had lost their meaning, had become undifferentiated, part of a fading background that barely registered on his diminished consciousness. He was present in the world, but increasingly separate from it, enclosed in the narrowing circle of his failing body and mind. Friends who visited in these final months found a man who was barely recognizable as the philosopher they had known. The sharp observer of human nature, the systematic thinker, the witty conversationalist. These were gone, replaced by an elderly man who sat or lay quietly, who sometimes seemed unaware of his surroundings, who no longer engaged with the world in any meaningful way. They would sit with him anyway, would speak to him gently, would hold his hand, would maintain the human connection even when reciprocation was no longer possible. On February 12, 1804, as winter still held the city in its grip, as the days were still short and the nights long, Immanuel Kant died. He was 79 years old, had lived his entire life in or very near to Königsberg, had achieved fame and influence without ever traveling far from his birthplace, had demonstrated that a life of profound intellectual achievement could be lived in a provincial city, following regular routines, maintaining ordinary social connections, without the drama or adventure that sometimes marks the biographies of great thinkers. The death was peaceful. He simply stopped breathing, the failing body finally giving up its struggle. The consciousness that had once organized such complex thoughts fading into whatever lies beyond consciousness. Those present attended to the final moments with care and respect, ensuring that he was not alone, that the transition from life to death was as gentle as possible. And then it was over. The man who had been Immanuel Kant, who had walked the streets of Königsberg for nearly 8 decades, who had thought his way through the fundamental questions of philosophy, who had taught generations of students and had written works that changed how human beings understood themselves and their world. That man was gone. Part 12. The funeral was held a few days later, conducted with the dignity and ceremony appropriate to someone of Kant's stature. The cathedral in Königsberg, where he had listened to sermons as a child, where the bells had marked the hours throughout his life, was filled with mourners. University faculty and students attended, along with city officials, friends, and ordinary citizens who knew his reputation or had encountered him during his daily walks. The service was long and formal, following the Lutheran traditions of the region, honoring a man who had contributed significantly to the intellectual life of his time. He was buried in the cathedral grounds, in a spot that would later be marked by a monument, a physical memorial to accompany the intellectual monuments he had created through his work. The stone and the location would serve as a place of pilgrimage for those interested in his philosophy, a tangible connection to the man who had done so much to shape modern thought. But the real memorial was the work itself, the books and essays that would continue to be read and studied, the ideas that would continue to be debated and developed, the influence that would extend across generations and across the world. In the weeks and months following his death, assessments and tributes appeared in journals and newspapers across Europe. Philosophers and scholars reflected on his contributions, on the revolutionary character of his critical philosophy, on the systematic thoroughness with which he had addressed fundamental questions. Some of these assessments were deeply appreciative, recognizing the magnitude of what Kant had accomplished, seeing in his work a turning point in the history of philosophy. Others were more critical, pointing to difficulties and problems in his arguments, suggesting limitations in his approach, beginning the process of philosophical engagement that would characterize responses to Kant's work for centuries to come. His ideas had already begun to spread beyond the academic world, to influence broader cultural and political thought. The emphasis on human dignity and moral autonomy, the claim that all rational beings shared fundamental equality, the vision of perpetual peace through international cooperation. These ideas resonated with Enlightenment values and with emerging democratic and humanitarian movements. Kant had not lived to see many of the social and political transformations that would draw inspiration from his philosophy. But the seeds were there, the conceptual resources available for those who would come after. The philosophical tradition that followed Kant was shaped profoundly by his work, whether in agreement or in opposition. German idealism emerged as an attempt to develop and systematize insights from the critical philosophy, to overcome what some saw as limitations or inconsistencies in Kant's approach. Thinkers like Fichte and Schelling and Hegel took Kant as their starting point, built elaborate philosophical systems that attempted to go beyond the boundaries he had established, to achieve the kind of absolute knowledge that Kant had deemed impossible for finite human beings. Others rejected central aspects of Kant's philosophy while remaining influenced by his questions and methods. Schopenhauer adopted Kant's distinction between phenomena and things in themselves, but gave it a very different interpretation, seeing the world as fundamentally driven by a blind will rather than by reason. Nietzsche criticized Kant's moral philosophy sharply, seeing in it a disguised form of Christian morality, but remained engaged with Kantian questions about truth and value and the human condition. In Britain and America, Kant's influence was slower to take hold, but eventually became substantial. His ethics influenced moral philosophy and political theory. His epistemology shaped debates about knowledge and science. His aesthetics provided frameworks for thinking about art and beauty. The specific details of his system were often modified or rejected, but the problems he had identified and the systematic approach he had modeled remained central to how philosophy was done. The city of Königsberg continued its existence after Kant's death, gradually transforming as the 19th century progressed, participating in the larger historical changes that reshaped Europe. The university where he had taught remained an important institution, and his connection to it was a source of pride and distinction. The streets he had walked were eventually renamed, some bearing his name in honor of his association with the city. The house where he had lived became a site of interest, though it would not survive the destructions of the 20th century. For the 20th century brought catastrophic changes to Königsberg. The city, which had been part of Prussia and then Germany, found itself at the center of European conflicts, was heavily damaged during World War II, and was eventually absorbed into the Soviet Union, renamed Kaliningrad, its German population expelled or fleeing, its character fundamentally altered. The cathedral where Kant was buried survived, though damaged, and his tomb remained, one of the few continuous links to the city's pre-war identity. The transformation of Königsberg into Kaliningrad meant that the physical spaces of Kant's life were largely erased or profoundly changed. The streets were different, the buildings mostly gone, the social and cultural fabric that had given the city its character replaced by something quite new. But the memory of Kant and the work he had produced while living in that city, these remained, transcending the historical changes that had transformed his birthplace beyond recognition. His books continued to be read, translated into dozens of languages, studied in universities around the world. The critique of pure reason, so difficult and forbidding when first published, became one of the foundational texts of modern philosophy, required reading for anyone seeking to understand the development of Western thought. His ethical works shaped debates about morality and politics, provided conceptual resources for human rights theory and democratic philosophy, influenced how people thought about duty and dignity and freedom. The interpretation of Kant's philosophy became an industry of its own, with scholars debating what exactly he meant, how his arguments should be understood, whether his conclusions followed from his premises, how his different works related to each other, how his thought developed over time. Different schools of Kant interpretation emerged, emphasizing different aspects of his work, reading him through different lenses, arriving at sometimes radically different understandings of what he had accomplished. But beneath all the scholarly debate and interpretation, certain basic insights remained powerful and influential. The idea that the mind actively structures experience rather than passively receiving it, that what we know is conditioned by the forms through which we know it, this epistemological insight shaped not only philosophy, but also psychology and cognitive science. The moral philosophy, with its emphasis on rational autonomy and human dignity, provided philosophical grounding for ideas about human rights and moral equality that became central to modern political thought. The systematic approach, the attempt to think through problems comprehensively rather than piecemeal, set a standard for philosophical work. Kant's life itself, the quiet, provincial life of regular routines and disciplined work, became part of his legacy. It demonstrated that profound intellectual achievement did not require dramatic biography, didn't need to be accompanied by adventure or scandal or bohemian unconventionality. A philosopher could live an ordinary life, could maintain regular habits and social connections, could find everything necessary for great work in a single city, in familiar streets and seasons, in the daily round of teaching and writing and walking and conversation. The image of Kant that persisted in cultural memory was of a man of remarkable discipline and regularity, someone who had organized his life rationally, who had demonstrated that freedom and order were not opposed, but could support each other. The punctual walks, the methodical routines, these became almost legendary, were told and retold, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with admiration, sometimes as cautionary tales about the dangers of excessive regularity. But they also pointed to something important about how intellectual work gets done, about the conditions under which sustained concentration and systematic thought are possible. As the 21st century arrived, 2 centuries after Kant's death, his work remained vital and relevant. Philosophers continued to engage with his ideas, to find in them resources for addressing contemporary problems, to argue about their interpretation and application. The specific historical context of Enlightenment Prussia that had shaped his thinking receded into the past, but the questions he had addressed about knowledge and morality and human nature and the limits of reason, these remained pressing, remained essential to how thoughtful people tried to understand themselves and their world. The routines that had structured his days, the walking and the writing and the teaching and the conversation, these had made possible a body of work that outlasted their creator by centuries. The discipline that might have seemed constraining was revealed to have been enabling, creating the conditions for freedom of thought, for intellectual achievements that transformed philosophy and influenced culture far beyond anything Kant himself could have imagined during his lifetime in Königsberg. In the end, there is something restful about contemplating Kant's life, something that invites a kind of quiet reflection. It was a life lived with purpose and consistency, a life that demonstrated the value of routine and discipline, a life that showed how intellectual work could be sustained over decades through habits and structures and the careful management of time and energy. It was a life lived largely in one place, finding depth through stability rather than through movement or variety. The city that had shaped him was gone, transformed beyond recognition. The physical spaces he had inhabited had mostly disappeared, victims of historical violence and change. But the work remained, the books on the shelves of libraries, the ideas in the minds of students and scholars, the influence in the assumptions and frameworks through which people thought about knowledge and morality and human dignity. This was the real legacy, not the buildings or the streets, but the thoughts, the arguments, the systematic philosophy that one man had developed through decades of patient, disciplined work in a northern city at the edge of the Baltic Sea. And now, as night settles gently over the past, as the story comes to its quiet conclusion, as Kant's long life of thought and teaching reaches its end, there is simply the stillness of completion, the peace of work finished, the gentle fading of consciousness into rest. The questions he asked continue to be asked. The problems he identified continue to challenge. The systematic approach he modeled continues to inspire. But the man himself, who walked those familiar streets, who sat at that desk morning after morning, who taught those students and wrote those books, that man has joined the countless others who have lived and worked and contributed what they could before passing into the silence that awaits us all.